now. Now this time we're not going to put any columns in the row. We're just using this nicely centered container that the row gives us so that we can put our story component in there. Okay? And we also make use of the margin bottom that this row here already has. So we cannot just put columns here in the row, we can also use it for other stuff. So let's put a story component here, story element, and for now there's nothing really in there. Let's just leave it like this, okay? So once again, let's start by formatting the section stories here in the home file. So give it some padding first of 15 rem top and bottom, let's say, and 0 left and right, of course. Then for now, we'll also give it a background color, and why not the same gray as before. So this is only temporary because then later on we're going to put that background video, okay? But for now, let's put this color there. Right, and so now we can add our new component in here. So it's a story as CSS. And that's not what I wanted main, okay? And this one is story. And close it. So what do we have in our story? First, the width is not 100% because that would be way too wide. So let's put it to 75%. Then we want to nicely center it. And again, it's a block element inside a block element. And so we can use margin, 0, and auto, right? Then let's also give it a box shadow, 0, then 3 in the Y direction, and a nice blur. Okay, then RGBA for the color as always. And just 0.1 should be enough. Also background color so that's visible against our background. So color white. And now finally a nice border radius. So we've been using 3 pixels. So let's do that here again to give it a consistent look. All right, and so here it is. Now we just need to fill it up with something, okay? You can also first give it some padding. 6 rem, let's say. And all right, that should be enough for now. So let's take a look what we have here. So this is once again an H3 element, and this is just a simple paragraph. Then here we have, of course, this image. But in order to create this effect where the text flows around the shape here, let's actually first start with just some round shape and then take care of the image later. So let's put a shape here in this side, and then on this side here a box where we can input the H3 and the paragraph. So then these two things side by side. All right. So we start with the shape, and I will make this one a figure called story shape. And I'm making this a figure because it's semantically the best thing to do, because we will have an image together with a caption. And so we have the image and then a caption. This Mary Smith name here is the caption. And so in HTML5 we have this figure element where we can put an image and then some caption with the fig caption element. But again, let's do that later. For now, let's leave it empty and continue with the part which contains the text. So just a div, story, text. And then in here, as I was saying, we have the heading tertiary again. So H3, heading tertiary. I had the best week ever with my family, is what it says here. All right, and then down there, just some paragraph. So let me just copy the random text that we have here. Or actually, no, let's get the text. It's better. So I think it's this one here. And paste it here. Okay. In here, in the heading, in the H3 element, we also have to add that, that margin to the bottom, right? Remember that? And I don't remember quite which class it was. Let me take a look here in the utilities. So I think we used to use this one here. So margin bottom small. So give it a save and take a look. All right. So let's actually now set the font size here for this entire thing to, here we have it. Oh, push this one here to the side. So we can do font size. And then there's a variable for that. Let me check out the name. So it's default font size. And so the paragraph will then inherit that. Okay, so let's now take care of the shape. And so this is just a div element for now. Let's give it some height and some width. So 15 rem and height as well. So it's basically a square for now. And then we want this element sitting on the left side. So float and left, in order to make the rest of the content float around it. That's how it works, right? And now just so we can see it, let's give it a background color as well. And orange red, again here my favorite. And let's take a look at that. Okay, and with that in place, let's actually add a bit more text here and then make this content float around as if it was floating around a circle. So a shape like a circle. Okay, we can do that. This doesn't even have to look like a circle. In order to do that, all we have to do is to use the shape outside property. And so let me show you how we can do that. So in here, we can use the shape outside property just like this. So we have to define a vectorized shape here once more. So we did that already when we used the clip path property. So we defined a polygon back then, remember? Well, when we did that back then, I told you that we could use other things here like circles or ellipses. And so now this time, let's use a circle. So a circle. And in here we can define the size of the circle and the position of the center of the circle. So how does that work? Well, the first number we put here is actually the radius of the circle. And so if we say 50%, then the radius will be half the height and the width of the element. And so in this case, that will be 7.5 rem. And so if the radius is 7.5 rem, then the diameter of the circle will of course be 15. And so that's exactly the size of the shape here, right? And then we say 50%, 50%, because that means that it's the center of the circle. So exactly the center horizontally and vertically. All right. Now I can change this later here in the inspector to show you the difference, but that is what we want here. And in order for this to work, the element must actually be floated. And that's the case here, right? And so we have already done that. And another thing that I should tell you about this is that in Safari, it currently only works with the WebKit prefix. So let's do that. Okay. And so like this, it works in Chrome and Safari currently. So it doesn't even work in Firefox, neither in Internet Explorer and Microsoft Edge. But of course, that's for now, as of recording of this course by the end of 2017. So if you're watching this in the future, this might have changed, okay? So that is that. So the browser support. And another thing that I have to tell you is that besides having to be floated here, this also only works if the element has defined dimensions, so width and height. So this is quite a demanding property. So it has to be floated, it has to have a height and a width. Only then it works. Okay. As I was saying, let's just add some more text here. Like repeating that part. Okay, let's take a look. And so you see it's different already here, right? So you see it's like wrapping around a circle. And instead of just imagining a circle, let's actually put one there. Okay. And we can do that by using the clip path property. So clip path, and then we just use the exact same circle. All right. Okay. And actually the same thing also with the WebKit prefix. Okay. So again, this shape outside, all it does is to define where the content flows around the element. In this case, a circle. And if we actually want the element to look like that circle, we can then use the clip path property, okay? And so that should be better now, should look more logical. And so yeah, actually it's really flowing around that element, right? Let's just take a look here. And as I was telling you, let me actually change these values here a bit. So you see if the circle would be bigger than this, but already stop working. So 50% is really the best that we can do. The same thing, of course, works here. But here we can just decrease the radius, and then of course the shape decreases. All right, let's now add some space here between this. And the best way to move around an element that is floated is to actually not mess with margins or anything like that. We should just use a transform, okay? So let's do that. Transform and then translate it. And of course, in this case, in the X direction, and let's do it -3 rem. And let's take a look at that. And well, that didn't do the trick actually, probably because it should be like this. All right, here we go. Okay, that looks much better. Now the thing is that we had this padding here going on, so these 6 rem, I think, which is the blue color here in this diagram. But with this transform now, we occupied half of that padding there on the left side. So let's add some more padding there. So these 3 rem that we had here, let's add that padding here on the left side. So after that, we say padding left 9 rem. So 6 plus the 3. Okay, and with that taken care of, let's actually now include that image. Okay, so in here. So inside that figure element, let's put the image. And so the image now will be going into the IMG folder and then nat 8. So this is what we want. And here let's just say person on a tour, because that's what this image will look like. So now we can get rid of that background color and take a look at what we see here. Well, that looks rather strange, doesn't it? So let's see where that image actually is. So this image is taking all of this entire space, so it's 2000 times 1333 pixels, and that's because we didn't give it a width. So remember, once again, flexible images for responsive web design, they always need a width, always without exception, okay? So I think we actually didn't give it a class name, did we? Figure, no, we did not. So it's the story image, just like this. So the story image. And so let's just give it a width of 100%. And why is that? Well, that's because this image is inside of a shape which has this width here well defined. And so if we say width 100%, that will be the 100% of the parent, so 15 rem. And so now it should look good. But well, actually it does not. And that's, of course, it's obvious because the image is wider than its high. And so if we gave it a 100% width, then of course it cannot fill this entire circle that we put here. And so it shouldn't be width 100% but height. And now then it should look okay. And so that looks much better now. Now one other thing that we didn't do yet is this non-rectangular design that I have here, okay? So let's take care of that, and we actually do it the exact same way as we did before with the features section. So let's do that. And so what we're going to do is to skew this entire story. So transform and then skew. Now the difference is that this time we're going to do it in the X direction and 12 degrees. So let's take a look at that. And so here we go. Actually it should be -12 because we want it in the other direction. And so that's what it looks like. Now we have the same problem that we had before, which is that now we basically have to skew this one and this one in the opposite direction. So how did we do it last time? Well, we did it like this. So we used the direct child selector and then selected everything. And in this case, that would just be the shape element as well as the, well, where is it actually? Yeah, so here the story text element. Let me actually define it here. I didn't do it yet. Okay, and so that would select the shape and the text. However, this is not going to work, and I'm going to show you why. Let me first put it here and then show you why it doesn't work. Okay, so it does actually work with the text, but not with the story. And that's because we already have one transform here going on. So this translate here is already a transform, and it actually takes precedence over this one. And so therefore only the translation applies and not the skew. Now in CSS there's currently no way of having two transform properties applying at the same time. And that's a shame, but I read that they are working on this. So I think that basically in the future these functions that we use here, they will be transformed to real properties. So maybe someday we will have skew x as a property and then we can specify 12 degrees. Or we can have translate x as a property and then specify -3 as the declared value. But for now, this is what we have. And so what I'm going to do is to simply add this one here to the text. And then just the skew part here to this transform. And then it's going to work. And so we have to make it separately. So adding the skew now on both here manually. And so like this, it is going to work. All right, so let's take a look at the original. And what is missing here, of course, is this effect that's going on, okay? But I'm leaving that to the next lecture so that we can take a break now, okay? So see you by then. Continuing building the story section that we've been building in the last lecture, we will now implement this hover effect that we have here. So as soon as we hover a story, we have two things going on in that image. So first, take a look and see what the image is doing. So basically the image is zooming out, okay? And then we have the text moving in and also the image getting blurred. So the image moves away and blurs and the text moves up and fades in, okay? And so that's a really nice effect, I thought. And so I included it here in the course. So let's start by adding the text actually, which will be our fig caption here. So a special HTML element for captions for figures. So fig caption, and I'm calling it story caption very simply. And so let's just put the name of the person here, and it was Mary Smith. So Mary Smith. All right, now where do we want this caption to be located? Well, we want it to be exactly on top of the image, right? So nicely centered on top of the image. Let's take a look at that again. So here it's exactly in the middle, both vertically and horizontally. So let's do that. And I'm sure you can guess it. We use position absolute. And then you can also guess that we need to set the container to position relative. And the container is in this case the story shape, right? So position relative. And then here it's the same thing as always. So top 50%, left 50%, and then translate -50% and -50%. And this time I don't have to explain it again to you why this works this way, right? So the color of the text was white with uppercase. Also with a nice font size, let's say 1.7 rem. And of course the text in there, in this box, should also be centered. Okay, so let's take a look at that now. All right, so it's nicely in the center here. Now what we want here to happen actually is when we hover this box here, so this story, is that this here moves up to the position and fades in. So what this means is that before we hover it, it actually needs to be invisible and it needs to be further down to this direction. So down here, so that it can then move up. So we should translate it down, but actually we already have the translate here. So it's -50 and -50. And so here on the epsilon coordinate, we can actually put 0 again, because then it would be a bit further down, right? You see, so now it's in here. And we could put it even more down if we wanted. We could say like, I don't know, 20% for example, and then it would move down even further, okay? And then we just set the opacity to 0. And so this is the initial state before we actually do the hover animation. Now, where does this hover actually occur? As we said, it's right here on the story, okay? And so we say story. So as soon as the story is hovered, then we want to change the caption, right? Makes sense? So, and what do we want to change? Well, the opacity to 1, of course, and the transform should translate in y to -50%. Okay, and why is that? Well, it's because the -50% is what we had here before, okay? So remember, the initial position was with this here at -50, but that's not what we want, but it's what we want after we hover on the story. Now I see a stupid mistake here once again. So it is hover, obviously it's hover. So I just invented a new pseudo class there, okay? So let's see if it works, but not before, of course, animating it as well. So transition, let's say all here, and 0.5 seconds. So let's check it out now. And well, that's not exactly what we wanted, but I think I know what the problem is here, and it is because we didn't have the exact same transform here. So it should be this exact translate. So not translate here, then translate y here. So instead, we should have this. And so this is where the -50% goes. All right. Yep, so that's what we want, right? Oh, and you saw that movement here in the end. So that little shaking, let me show it to you again. So you see at the end, it moved like a little bit, okay? So let's add, once again, back face visibility to this element. So remember we did this in the header as well, just to fix this small glitch. And so now it should be gone. Yep. I don't know if you saw it before, but it was definitely there. It moved like 1 pixel to the right side or to the left. And so now that is absolutely gone. And so now the second part of this animation is this image, which blurs and moves away. And actually I see that this image here is in a different position. So this lady here is nicely centered, while in here she's not. So let's take care of that. And let me show you why that happens. Okay, so this is where this image is. You see this blue box? That's where the image is. And so I guess we should translate the image itself to be more in the center of the figure, right? So let's do that. So let's translate this image a little bit. And where is it? Here. So transform, translate X, and let's say -4 rem. Okay. And so now we can work on that effect that we just saw. So again, it's when we hover the story, and then what we want to change is actually the image. Okay, and the first thing that happened was that it zoomed out, okay? And well, that looks a bit strange. So somehow, because of this translation that we did here, it cut out this thing. So let's fix that. And what's going to fix that is once again backface visibility hidden. Okay, so whenever we're dealing with this kind of like animations and translating stuff, when something weird happens, then many times this back-based visibility fixes that. And again, as I explained to you before, I guess no one really knows why it happens this way or why this works this way. But what matters is that it actually does work. So, okay, I found this out myself also the hard way through a lot of experimenting and searching on Stack Overflow and all that stuff. And so now I can teach that to you, okay? So just to make sure again how this works, we zoom out the image when we hover, okay? So what that means is that initially we have to zoom in a bit, so scale it basically, and then when we hover, set the scale to a lower value so that it happens like this. You see? Basically we scaled the image down. So let's do that. So in initial state, we need to add some scale here. Let's say it's at 140%, so 1.4. And then as soon as we hover the image, we want it to be, well, let's actually copy it. Okay, and then we want it at 1 as soon as we hover it. And so that should work now. So let's go to our version. And indeed, all we have to add, of course, is now this transition. So it's the same as this one, so let's just copy it. And here we go. Very nice. So that looks nice already. Now all we have to do is to add that blur. And actually it's not only blur, but it also gets a bit darker, this image, as we hover it. So take a look. It gets a bit darker. Maybe you didn't see it right away, but actually it did get a bit darker. And so let's learn about filters. So there's a very nice CSS property, which is simply called filter. And in there, you have a lot of different filters that you can apply. So let's use blur and use 3 pixels. And again, I'm going to show you different values in the DevTools then in the inspector. And then also, since we want to make it darker, let's say we want brightness. And then a value lower than 100% makes it darker, and the value above 100% makes it brighter, basically, okay? And so that should do the trick. So that's it. It's blurred and it is darker than it was before. So let me now show you some different values. So this is where the hover is applied, right? So we can go to the DevTools, hit this one here and then on hover. And so now we can see it hovered even without actually hovering it with the mouse, okay? And then here we see our CSS styles. So we can blur it even more. So this is what it looks like when it's even really blurred. So we had 3, 6 also looks great, but let's leave it at this. And then in here, so 100 is the original. We put it at 80, but we can make it really dark if we want, or really bright, something like this. Okay. And there are, of course, other filters. So we have blur, brightness, contrast, grayscale, hue, rotate. Let's check that one out. 50%. Or maybe it's in degrees actually, if it's rotate. 50 degrees. So you saw there's a difference there. So lots of filters here going on. You can give it more opacity, saturate it, put a sepia filter, and so you can definitely experiment with those, okay? So alright, this is already completed. Now all we have to do is to add the second box below it, and then also that small button that we have here. So this one, okay? So that shouldn't be all too hard. Let's just head over to the HTML and add another one of these rows. So number 9 this time. This person is called Jack Wilson. And then let's just change his text. Wow, my life is completely different now. All right, and that should work already. Yep. So no surprises here, it works just as before. And now just a small button here, just to make it really complete. Okay, so this is pretty similar to the one that we had before in here. So here we had this green button going on. This time we want the other button. So we have the button green and the normal button, and then I think the other one is called button text. Let's see if that works. I'm not really sure. Let's check it out here in the button. So button text. So only one dash there, because it's not a modifier, it's just a different name. So button text. And then read all stories. And then again that right arrow that I showed you in another lecture. So right arrow. Okay. And so that looks pretty good. And if you take a look now and compare it to our original version, all there's left to do now is to add this background video. But that will be a separate lecture. So part 3 of building this lecture. So see you then. Let's now finally code up the background video of the stories section. So we have this video here basically spanning this entire section here. So from the beginning of the section all the way until the end. And it also works no matter what the screen width, okay? So on all screen width, the video simply stays here spanning over the entire section, okay? So let's now do that. And we start as always in the HTML. So how are we going to approach this background video? Well, what we're going to do is to add an element to this section, of course, and make it the exact same size as the section, and then put the video in that container, okay? So let's do that. So I'm going to call this background video, so BG for background. And that's a container. And now in here is where we actually will use the video element. So in HTML5 there's a video element which allows us to embed videos on a web page. So video, and I'm going to call it BG and then content. So we're still following the BEM methodology here. Now this is how videos work. So we will not specify this source tag there, but instead what we're going to do is to specify something called the source in here. So again, instead of using the SRC attribute here in the video tag like we would do with an image, there's actually a source tag in HTML which allows us to embed a video file into this video element. Okay, so source, and then here we have the source attribute that we had in the images as well. So let's take a look at our images folder, because that's where the video is. And actually there are two formats. So we have one in the MP4 format and one in the WebM format. Okay, so img video MP4. And so I should say that this is a type video and then MP4. And then another one, source src attribute, and now img video and the other one. And then type video of the format WebM. Okay, now I got these videos from a very handy website which is called Cover. So cover with 2 Rs.co. And so here you can download all kinds of different videos for your websites. And they're of course all free to use. And so when you download the video from here, it already comes in these two versions, so the MP4 and WebM. And we need these two formats in order to make absolutely sure that they work across all of the browsers, at least all of the modern browsers. Of course, this is not going to work in a Internet Explorer 8 or 9 or something like that. But again, most of the things that I'm showing you here are not working on those very old browsers that shouldn't be used anymore anyway. And now what we usually also do is to then put some text here, like your browser is not supported. Because what will happen if none of these can be played by the browser, then this text here will show in the browser instead of the video. And so if the MP4 cannot be played and the WebM cannot be played, like in a very old Internet Explorer, then this text here will appear. Next, what we can also do and what we should do is to add some commands here basically to this video. So we can like specify attributes for the video that we're implementing. So we can say, for example, autoplay. And so now this video will start playing automatically. Now autoplay is usually seen as a bad thing, but in this case, since it's a background video and since we're also putting it muted, okay, so no sound on the video, this is another property that we can specify here. All right, and so since it's muted, it's not really a problem to having it on autoplay. Something else we can do here, like another option, is to say loop, because otherwise it's not going to loop, okay? So these are the three commands that we should put here. So the three options basically. So let's now take a look at what we got here. And so indeed, here it is. It's not yet the background video, of course, we didn't format that yet, but at least the video, you see, it is implemented by now. And it's bigger than the screen size also, so we should take care of that. And then we should also position it exactly where we want it to be. And let's actually start with that, okay? So, BG video. And what I'm gonna do here is to actually create a brand new component. And that's because, once again, we may want to reuse the component on some other place of the website, all right? So this doesn't have to be the only place where we have a background video. And if we can have another one, well, then that should mean that it's basically a component. So BG video here. Forgot the underscore. And okay, so BG video. And I also have to, as always, define it in here. BG video. All right. So BG video. And as I was saying in the beginning, we will position this one using absolute positioning. Position absolute. Top 0, left 0. And then we want the height to be exactly the one of the parent, and the same thing for the width. 100%. Okay, so that is just the container. Now what I have to do then also is to set the parent here, so section stories, to position relative, right? So it's here in home, and let's say position relative. So let's take a look now at how this works. And whoa, great. So it's already actually behind our elements here. So great, right? Well, actually not behind all of them. So you see the button and the H3, they're hidden behind that. Okay, and so we can take care of that by simply setting a very low Z index, and it can even be negative. And so we can be sure that it will be behind all of the other elements, right? Let's take a look again. Oh, and actually it's now like also hidden behind the section as well. And that's because we still have that background color going on there, which we don't want. And so now basically it's transparent, and then it should be visible. And indeed, here we go. Now the next thing that we also want to do is to actually give it some opacity. So we don't want to see the video like this, like with all these colors. It should just be a very subtle effect in the background there. So let's give it some opacity so that we can just see it like really just a little bit, okay? So something like this. And that's already getting pretty close to what we had in the original. Now another thing that we have here going on is that this one is not really opaque like it is here in the example. So you see that here you can actually look through this element. And so let's do that. So we have to change the background color here. We cannot just say opacity 50% or something like we did with the video, because then everything, so including the content, would also get this opacity. And we only really want this background to be like that. So here, let's go back to the story. And so where is it actually? Ah, here. So we use RGBA. And then let's say like 60%. So that looks much nicer, I think. And so now we have to fix this problem that the video is overflowing. So it's taking its entire width And it's also not really filling this entire section, right? Because the section goes all the way until down here, I believe. Yes, indeed. And so of course we want to fill the entire section, and we also don't want it to be outside of our web page like this, obviously. So there's a very good way to do that. And so let me show it to you. So we need to select now that video itself. Content. And let's start by saying that we actually want it to be 100% high and 100% wide. But that alone is not going to fix it. So let me show you why that is. Okay, so now the width is 100% of the section, but it's now covering even less of our section. And that's because this, of course, maintains the aspect ratio of this video. So if it was wider before, then of course it also was higher. So it could occupy more of our section here. So what do we do to actually occupy this entire section here, but also while maintaining the aspect ratio? And there is, of course, once again, quite a new property which allows us to do exactly that with CSS. And it's called object fit. And when we set object fit to cover, then this is actually pretty similar to the background size cover, which we do all the time with the background images, right? So what object fit cover will do is that the element, and so in this case the video, will fill the entire parent while still maintaining its aspect ratio. Okay? And the parts of the video that then don't fit the parent element, they will simply be clipped off. Okay? So let's take a look now. And here we go. So that's the solution, and that makes it work actually. All right. Well, still not 100%, but we're almost there. And again, what did the trick was this object fit cover. So again, this is very similar to having background size set to cover, where it tries to cover the entire element with the image. And so object fit is similar to that, but instead of working with background images, it works with HTML elements, or videos in this case. But of course, it would work just the same with images. And so we can have one parent element, then in there an image, and then with object fit, we can make that image cover the parent element. And we could actually use other values here instead of cover. So let me show that to you. Okay. So right now we have cover, but we could also have, and let me reload this, but we could also have fill. And what it would do then is to make it fill in all the height and all the width, but not maintaining its aspect ratio. So you see now actually in the video here that the aspect ratio is different. It's not the way it should be. Let me remove that and you will actually immediately see it, right? It doesn't look natural anymore. Okay, so it should be cover. Then it's good again. Okay, and finally it could also be contain. But I think that's also not really useful, because basically that's what we had before. It's trying to fill its parent element, but without clipping anything on the sides. And that's not what we want. So we want cover. Then it's filling the parent element from top to bottom, or from top to bottom here, of course. And then clipping on the side what is too much. Okay. Now it's actually not 100% clipping everything that it should. So it's going a bit outside here, and so we have to fix that. And so, such as we did before, when something overflowed our element, we use overflow hidden. So this is a very handy property, so keep that one in mind. Whenever something like this happens, you can just throw that in there, and it will fix the problem, just like this, okay? And so I think that is actually it. So you just implemented a background video in CSS. So that's really cool, right? Maybe you have seen this effect somewhere on some page, but never really knew how it works. And it's actually a bit more simple maybe than you think, right? So it was just a handful of different properties and then pulling the video into the HTML, and that's it. So another section completed. So we're moving on greatly here. All that we have left to do is actually this booking section here, then this very simple footer. There's navigation here, of course, so that's something that I left for the end because it's rather complex. So there's this great navigation here. And then another thing that's also missing that I showed you in the beginning is that when you hover over these cards and hit the button, then it actually shows this pop-up box here. So this is all pure CSS once more. And so you're going to learn that over the next couple of lectures, okay? But we're making good progress, so keep hanging in there, and I'll see you next time. Hello, what's up? I see you're still with me there, and you cannot imagine how much I appreciate that. So here I have yet another section full packed with new stuff for you. And what we're going to build in this section is a beautifully styled form with a lot of complex CSS going on. So you're going to learn how to implement something I call the solid color gradient. Also, you'll learn how the general and adjacent sibling selectors work and why we need them, how to use the input placeholder pseudo element, how and when to use the focus and valid placeholder shown and checked pseudo classes for styling forms, and finally, to finish this section, you're going to use all that knowledge to build custom radio buttons to give our form a special touch. So taking a look at what we're going to build here, this is it. So this entire section with this background gradient here going on, and then this box where the form is then actually located. So we have this box with this background image, and then this here is what I call the solid color gradient, but we'll see that a bit later. So let's now start by actually formatting this entire section with the background gradient, and then implementing this box here first, including the background image and this non-rectangular design thing here again, okay? So this is again the same style as we had before, so such as these edges here, or these edges here on the cards, this edge here. So once again, we use that design element in here, okay? So let's get to work. So we start by adding a new section. And this one is the booking section. So let's simply call it section book. Then in here we have a row, okay? Because we want to center that box nicely in the middle. And then in there I'm going to place an element called book, okay? So this book here will be this entire box, okay? Now why am I doing it this way? Well, let's think about reusable pieces and components again. I think it's only logical that we might this form here to be a component so that we could reuse it somewhere else on the page. So all these elements here that we're going to code, these all should be part of our component. So we will probably have a component called form. Now what will be unique to this page and what we really don't need to reuse, I think, is the rest of this design, like this box here with this background image and also with this edge here going on. So that's not really a reusable piece, I believe, because imagine that we have another page with a form somewhere else, maybe even without occupying the entire width here of the page. Imagine just like a small contact form somewhere on the page. Then maybe we would want to reuse the form, like these pieces here, but not this entire thing with this entire background image and occupying all the space, right? So what we're going to do is to add all of these styles that are unique to the home page here once more to our home file. And then the form itself here, that's what will be a component, okay? So let's go back now. And that's why I called this here book. And then the component later on is what will have the name of a form. All right, but before doing that, let's actually start by styling this section book as well as the book class here. So in the home folder, put here in the beginning, can close this one here actually. So here at the end, just add a new selector. So we want a padding of again 15 rem and 0. And now you saw that we had that gradient going on, so background image, linear gradient to right bottom again. Well, this here is not correct. And now the colors. So color primary light and color primary dark. And now the book class, we just remember that box with the background image. So let's actually start by adding that background image. So URL, move up one level, IMG, and this one is called nat10. and the background size of cover. Now, one thing that I didn't mention yet is that actually instead of using a keyword like cover, we can also use a value here like 100%. And actually 100% here means the exact same thing as cover. And that's because cover stretches the image to occupy the entire container where the background image is applied, and that's what 100% does. So also 100% of the width. Okay, now just for testing purposes, so that we can actually see what's going on here, let's add a height to this entire box. Let's say 50 rem. Okay, but again, this is just for testing purposes. Later on, we want the content of the box, of course, to define its height. Okay, but just to take a look at it. Nice, so here we go, okay. Now let's add some rounded corners here and also a box shadow, like we have on the original version. So border radius, once again 3 pixels. I think that's the one we've been using. And that's actually also a good candidate for defining a variable, okay? Because now I'm not really sure if we've been using 2 pixels or 3 pixels. And so if we had a variable, that would solve it. So I encourage you to actually go ahead and do that. I'm not going to waste more time with that here, okay? But you should totally do it. So box shadow again. And a 0.15 this time. So a bit darker than usually because we have this colored background here. And well, actually it's not really showing up. Let's take a look at that. Okay, I'm missing here the unit. So that's why it wasn't working. All right, so now we have some subtle shadow here. We could actually increase it here to 0.2 or something. So the background is already dark, and so we have to make the shadow a bit darker as well, obviously. And now just to show you the 100% with the cover, let's decrease this and take a look at what's going on. And you see, so 99%, and then you see that the image starts repeating here on this side, okay? So imagine we put 50%, then the entire width would be divided into 2 here. And of course, since the aspect ratio stays the same, we also have some more blank space, and so the image starts multiplying down here as well. So if you put now 25, we would have a 4x4 grid, I believe. And yeah, so if that's the style you're going to, maybe, I don't know, you can do that. Even something like 10%. Or of course, we could also go higher. So imagine like 150, right? All right, but of course, we stay with 100%. Now, taking a look at what we have here, what we're missing here is this design here, okay? Now, what we could do here is to add another element, and then on that element, we would use clip path again in order to make for this shape here, right? But we are going to do something different, and that's what I like to call the solid color gradient. And what is that? Well, in fact, this is just another background color that we have on top of the image. So this is actually a gradient. So it starts from this side here, it's white all the way here, and then here all of a sudden we change to a transparent color here. Okay, so again, this is in fact really a gradient. And let me show you how we do that. And so we're going to explore the gradient function here in a bit more detail, because with gradients can do a lot of stuff, and that's why I wanted to show you this technique here as well. So you see that we always have different ways of achieving the same things. And I'm doing that here in this course, in this project, so that I can show you as many things as possible, okay? So we want the gradient to be on top of the image, and so we simply add another background image here, separated by commas, where the image is the second one, right? So linear gradient, and let's start with 2 colors. So RGBA, so the first one is white, right? So color white, but it's slightly transparent. And that's why I use this RGBA here, of course. So let's start with using some other color, okay? And once again, I'm using orange red. So this color that I really like. And this is what it would like simply without doing anything else. Okay, so from white to red. So next we should specify the direction here, okay? So we're using the to right or to right bottom here all the time, okay? But something else we can do instead of doing that is to specify an angle. So if we say, for example, 90 degrees, then instead of going that direction it was going, it will be now rotated. And so 90 degree is basically going in the X direction. So the gradient is going from left to right. But we can change that. and put, for example, 105 degrees. Okay, then it looks like this, which for now looks pretty much the same, but you'll see why we do it this way, okay? And now comes the most important part of this technique, because in here we can actually specify percentages. So we can specify at different points of the gradient which color there should be. So we can say that in the beginning, let's say at 0%, we want this color here to be. So the black should be at 0%, okay? Let me actually give different lines for these different arguments here, okay? So 105 degrees, then this color at 0%, and then the orange red at the end. So 0%, then we can say that at 50%, we want this orange red color. And so this is what it's gonna look like. Okay, and so what happens here? So we said at a 50%, we want it to be orange. And so here is 50%, and so here it's completely orange. It's not a gradient happens between the left side, which is where the 0 is, and here where the 50% is. Okay, and we can now go even further and say that at 50%, we also want it to be white. So what's going to happen then? Well, that's it. That's what's going to happen. So we say at 0, we want white. We say at 50, we want white. And then at 50, which is right here, the next step, we want orange. And then that is what happens. So let's experiment with some more values here. For example, we could say, where is it now? We could say here instead 50, like 40, okay? And then it would be white at 0, white at 40, and orange approximately here. And so then the gradient would happen between the 50 and the 40, okay? But if we put these two values at the same number, then what happens is that we have this solid line here. And so we have basically a gradient between two solid colors. And that's why I like to call this the solid color gradient. Now, in order to make it look like our original version, all we have to do is to replace this color here, orange-red, by another color which is transparent. So, transparent. That's also a valid CSS color, and it's simply the absence of any color, okay? And so we can use that to our advantage in this technique here, okay? So transparent, replace it here, transparent, and that's it. So with this simple trick, we just created this awesome effect here, and it was really simple, no clip path or anything like that. Now this isn't of course always possible to do. So for example, in here, where we had this, and here we have this wedge cutting out. Well, in here, we really had to use clip path. And so different tools for different situations. All right, so let's now start with our form actually. And well, before that, we actually need a container where this form can be. And so let's call that one book form. So book form. So book form will basically simply be a container sitting on the left side of this box. Okay, so basically sitting in here, so that in there we can then put our form. And so that again is unique to this page. So let's put it again here. And that's also why I gave it the element name here. So block element. So book is the block and now the form is the element. And so let's say I wanted the width to be 50%. So basically to occupy half of this entire box. And then let's give it some padding as well. Let's say 6 RAM. All right. And so now we're ready to start our form component. Okay. So let's go back here. And then in here, we will have finally our form. And the form will also be an HTML form element, of course. So when we have a form, we should always use the form element. So form, and I'm also giving it the class of form. Now the action is basically the script or the file where we want the form to go as soon as we hit the submit button. And now this form is not going to do anything. We just want to style it and we're not going to give it any functionality. And so we just make it go to like nothing here. Okay. So form. Now in here, we're going to have several groups, let's call them. So one group for each of these, let me show you. So one group is for this field and the label, because there actually is a label. So here, down here, you can see the label. So we're going to implement that text jumping down there, okay? And here also is a label, which is invisible. So yeah, now you see it. So each of these will be a different div element. so that we can then give it some space between the next element. So form group, and actually this here is misspelled, so form. And then in each of these we have an input and a label. And I'm sure you're already familiar with these HTML elements. So input with the class form input, and the type here that we want is text in this case. We also wanted to have a placeholder saying full name, and then we want it to be required. So we can put this little attribute here calling required, and then the browser will not allow us to submit the form unless this field here is actually filled out, okay? So that's what the required does. And now the label. So label, and I'm going to call it form label, so pretty straightforward here. Now as for the for attribute here, I'm not sure if you know how it works. Well, all we have to do is to specify an ID in the input here, which we want to link to that label. So we add an ID here, and I'm simply going with name, okay? And so now when I put this ID in here, then the label and the input will be connected. So let me actually show you that. So here's the input, and well, actually, of course, I have to put something here. So full name is the text that we want to display. So let's see it. And so now if I click on this label, which is connected to this input, the input will be focused like this, okay? So again, I click, and then this will be focused. And so they are now connected. Great, so one group, and the next group will be for the email address. And so there's actually a type in HTML5, which is email, and then the browser will automatically figure out if we're writing in a valid email address or not, okay? So email address. Again, we want this to be required, and then name will be replaced with email, of course, in both places, email and email at the same time, okay? And now just one thing that we're missing is that we actually have this h3 element here, okay? So let's put that in there, and I will start copying it from the other section here. So where is it? Yep, so here, let's copy this one and put it here in our form. So right here. All right. So start booking now. Okay, maybe that's actually a bit too much space here. And we also don't want it to be centered here, okay? And so now it's very easy to do that. All we have to do is to just remove this class. And so that's gone, okay? Now maybe we don't want something that big here. So we can go with margin bottom medium, okay? So we already have a class for that. Let's reuse it. Okay, so with all that in place, we are now ready to actually style these elements here, okay? And so let's do that in the next lecture. Let's continue styling our form in this lecture. So once more, we add a new component here to a components folder. So form.scss, add .form in here, and of course also include it here. So form, save it and close it. All right. So we have the form, then in there we have the form input. And of course the form label, at least for now. And of course we also have the form group. And let's start with the input actually. Okay, so font size of 1.5, RAM. Let's give it a nice padding of 1.5 in the top and bottom, and then 2 on left and right. And usually we always do it like this, like in buttons and form elements. We give it a bit more on the sides because that makes element look better actually. If we just give it 1.5, it looks a bit strange. It looks like it's smaller on the sides than it actually is. So always a bit more on the sides. Okay. Now a nice border radius as well. Let's do it only 2 pixels this time because the element itself is a lot smaller. And then we want it to have a background color where we can look through a bit. So we use RGBA again. White, and let's say 50% opacity. Also, we want to get rid of the border, so border none. All right, let's take a look at that before we do anything else. Okay, now the first thing that you notice is probably the font family. It's not the same as you have in the rest of our web page. So the font family is not Lato. And that's the default thing that the browsers do actually. So by default, they don't give it the font family that we have for a web page. So let's set it. And well, we could do font family and now set it to Lato, but we can do something better with something that we learned in one of the theoretical lectures. And we can say the font family directly to inherit. And that's it. And so now it will automatically inherit the font family as well. So you know that usually all elements, they automatically inherit the font family, but not the input elements. And so we set it manual here. And then you see it will work now. So slight difference, but it's clearly visible, okay? Now let's just give some space here between these form groups, okay? So we want a margin bottom, but we don't want it on the last one. So we use our old trick where we style everything except the last child. So margin bottom, let's say 2 rem, and that will improve things a bit. Okay, what you also saw here was that when we selected the element, then you saw this blue border here going on, right? And that's also something that we don't want to see. Now this blue border appears on the input elements when it's focused, okay? So this is the focus state. And in CSS, we can actually style it using the focus pseudo element. Okay, so let's do that. So instead of like active or hover or something like that, it's simply called focus. And that blue line that we see is called the outline. So we used outline before, like in the first section in the beginning where we have these 3 images, and then when we hover, we have this green border around them. That's also an outline, okay? But this one is an outline which the browser gives us by default. And we don't want that, so we set it to none. Now this focus is actually very important for people who use a web page without a mouse, but only with a keyboard. And so when they move around with a keyboard on a web page, they need to know which form elements are actually focused. And so for accessibility reasons, we should never just do input focus and then set the outline to none and call it a day. Okay, so we should always make the form elements that are focused visible. All right, so let's do that, and we will do it by giving it a box shadow, okay, and also give it a border at the bottom. So box shadow, 0, 1 rem in the Y direction, 2 rem of blur, and then color black with 0.1. And then, as I said, a border at the bottom of 3 pixels. Then we say it should be solid, and then we say we want it to be our primary color. So the border is just a shorthand property for the border width, the border style, and the border color. But it's easier to just specify them all at once here. So let's take a look at that now. And all right, so now we have this nice shadow and the green line as well. Now what you see here is that when you click this, you will see that this one here moves down a bit. Okay, and that's because of the 3 pixels that are created here for the border here that's being added. Okay, and so what we should do is to actually add that border here in the initial state as well. Okay, but we set it to transparent. All right, and so it will be invisible in the normal state, and then as soon as we click it, as it's focused, it becomes green. Now another thing that I also want to do is to give it a width, so 100%, and we should, since we're at it, also display it as a block, okay? So that's better, so that it has its own line here. All right, well, maybe it's a bit too much here with the 100%, so let's just put it back to 90. But you see that now this effect that we had going on here, where this one then jumped up and down, is now gone, okay? So let's do that. And another thing that we can do is to actually style the placeholder here. Okay, so that's also nice. You see it in here, it's this really light gray here. And so with that, we show that it's actually only a placeholder. And as soon as we start typing, you see that it becomes darker. Okay, so let's do that. So 90% here. Let us use a brand new pseudo element, and that one is called WebKit input placeholder. Okay, so WebKit input placeholder. And this right now will only work on Safari and Chrome, okay? But hopefully it will get implemented in the other browsers as well. So remember that pseudo elements, they are with these 2 colons, and they represent things that are actually on the web page. And so a placeholder is of course a pseudo element and not just a pseudo class, which stands more for states, yeah, like focus, right? So let us style the color for this one here. And so I guess we now need a new variable because this is a new color that we don't have yet. So this is another dark gray, color dark, the gray or gray dark, and I'm going to call this one number 2. And so this one should really be number 1, but I don't want to change it now because then I have to go to the place where I used this here and change the variable name. So we should have actually thought about this right from the beginning, but well, that wasn't the case. So now we can't use that, okay? All right, and so let's use that color actually. Where, here it is. So we don't need the home anymore. I will actually call this variable name here. All right. Now, another thing that I wanted to show you, let's first check this one here. Well, this didn't really change. Well, let's check it out again. And yeah, of course, I see why it doesn't work. It's because this one is of course not on the form. You see, we are here on the form level. So right now we're saying form and then WebKit input placeholder. But of course, this is on the input, right? And so this should of course be in here. And since we're at that, this here is also not in the right place. I mean, it works, but we're not using the power of nesting here, right? So why I repeat the input, we should just do it like this, right? So now it should work. And yeah, here we go. So now it's this column, then when I start typing, it becomes dark. And actually it becomes pretty dark, it becomes black actually. And that's because once again, the font color is not really inherited. So we have to set this once again to inherit. So that's something really particular to these input elements. They don't inherit basically the font properties, okay? Now another very cool thing that we can do is to actually make use of the validation that Google Chrome has. So remember that I told you that here in the email input, for example, we specified the email type, and then Google Chrome will test if we're actually writing in a valid email address or not. And if we're not, it will basically be invalid. And in CSS, we can actually use that because on an input element, we can use the invalid pseudo class. Okay, the invalid and of course also the valid pseudo class. And then we can apply specific styles to when the value is valid or when it's not valid. So let me show it to you actually. So in here, we start with this here yellow, and yellow, or let's say orange. Orange means that the input is not correct. So let me start writing something here. So hello is not really a valid email address. But now you saw as soon as I started writing here after the @ symbol, it turned green, right? The same thing here. So we said that it should be required, but right now there's no text and so it's not valid. So right now if I would submit this form, then it will say, please fill out this form. But if I now start writing here, it becomes green. If I delete this one here, it gets orange again, and it says, please fill out this field. And if I just write something invalid, it says, please include an @ in the email. And so we can take advantage of that invalid states, okay? Now, one last thing, when do we actually want this to happen? Well, we want it to happen only when the field is actually focused, right? And so we set focus once again, and then invalid. And that's it. So when we have an invalid focused input element, then this is the style that we want to apply. So we want a border that is orange. And so let me get the color here. So it's called color secondary dark. color secondary dark. Okay, and that should do the trick. And here it is. So right now it's invalid. And now I typed, and now it is valid. And then here, hello at jonas.io. And so now it's valid. Like this, it's not valid. And like this, it's also not valid. All right, so that works. So now, before we move on to the radio buttons, let's do that trick where we make this part here invisible and only appear as soon as we write something here in the input. And so basically it will then look like that name here, that text would fly out and come out here, down here, okay, because it's actually the same text. So this effect here, you see the full name and it moves down like that, okay? So nice little effect, but I think it makes all the difference to have these subtle things on a web page, okay? So let's now actually start by formatting here this label. So we give it a pretty small font size of 1.2 rem. Make it bold with 700 of font weight. And then we give it a margin left with 2 rem. That's because we want it positioned exactly on the same position which the text is on top. And then a margin to the top of 0.7 rem. Okay, and finally we should also display this as a block, because otherwise, you know, we cannot really use these box model properties here on the element, right? So let's take a look at that now. And yeah, so now you see this is now really aligned here so that the effect will actually work that we're looking for. And now we need to take care of the magic where this is only shown as soon as we have some text in here. And so once again, this is really only CSS and no JavaScript included. And what allows us to do this is to use the placeholder shown pseudo class. Okay, and so the placeholder shown is again here on the input. Now I'm not going to really place it here, and I'm going to explain to you why in a second. But for now, trust me that this is how it has to be done. So input and then placeholder shown. So when the placeholder is shown on the input element, then we can now style it. But it's not the input that we want to style, right? What we want to style is the label, right? We want the label to be hidden and not the input. And so in here, we also have to select the label. So let me first do it like this. But probably you notice that this is not going to work. And why is that? Well, because the label is not a child element of the input, right? So we see in the HTML that they are siblings, so they're at the same level. They're both childs of the form group, okay? So again, input and label, they are siblings. Because they're on the same level, they're both children of this parent element. But in CSS, we have a very powerful selector, and that is called the sibling selector. And so this is how it works. And this one is actually the adjacent sibling. So what is an adjacent sibling? Well, it's just a sibling that comes immediately after the element that we select in the first place. So we first select input, and then with the adjacent sibling selector, we select the first sibling, which is the label. And so in this case, this works. But if there was some other elements in between here, let's say here was another div, and then there was like some button or something, okay, so this would totally be possible, then we could still use a sibling selector, but we would have to use this one, okay? So this is the general sibling selector. So this one works if there are more levels in between. But now we can use the adjacent sibling because the sibling is right next to the first element. Now one particular thing about the sibling selector is that the sibling that we have to select, in this case the label, always has to be after the first element, so the input in this case. All right, so again, the label needs to be after the input, which is the case here, in order to be selected with the sibling selector. So just as we have it here. So we have the input and then we select the sibling of that element and a sibling called label. If the HTML was written the other way around, so if we had the label before the input, like this wouldn't work. There would be no way of selecting the label here from the input. Okay, and that's the reason why I wrote the HTML in this order. All right, so when you need to use the sibling selector, then you need to be careful about that. All right, So when the placeholder is shown, meaning that we have written nothing in our input, we want the label to be hidden, right? So opacity 0. And then another thing that we should do is to set the visibility to hidden. And that's because if we just set the opacity to 0, then the element will basically still be on the page, but only invisible. But if we set it to visibility hidden as well, then it's really gone, okay? So why don't we just use visibility hidden without the opacity? Well, because we cannot animate the visibility, okay? And so we use the opacity because we actually want to animate this effect, right? And actually, let me show it to you. So setting the transition here to all in 0.3 seconds, and then you will already start seeing the effect. So reload, and so now it's gone, okay? Meaning that right now the placeholder shown pseudo class is active, okay? And so right now this selector here is working. So the placeholder is shown. But as soon as we start writing, the placeholder is gone, and then these styles here will be gone as well. So that's what happens now. So you saw the opacity was animated, and so it faded in. And now it faded out, in, out, you see? Now what we want this to happen is to also move down from here, right? And so in initial state, it has to be there. Transform, translate, and of course it's in the y direction, and it's going up, and so -4 rem. Okay, let's actually show it to you how it will look like, still visible. So to justify why I used the -4 rem, okay, so this is where the input is. In this state, and when I start writing, it moves down, okay? So let's make it invisible again, give it a save. And now, here we go. So, really cool, right? In the next lecture, we will then take care of actually adding these radio buttons here. So stay tuned for that next lecture. In the third part of the booking section, let's now finally build our custom radio buttons. But before we do that, let's just add something that we were missing here, which is the animation as soon as we click here or as the color changes, okay? So this bar here, this underlined color. So this has no animation right now, so we should very quickly just add that. So the transition property and all, let's say 0.3 seconds. And so that should be different now. And yeah, you saw that. So it's much nicer now. Okay, so what do we have here on these radio buttons? Well, you see that we have two elements here. So basically this one here and this one. And then when you click, of course, the button becomes active and we choose the option that we click on. So let's start with the HTML here. And so once again, let's do a form group. And I forgot to put the dot. Now for each of them, we actually want a container here. So let's say form radio group. Okay, and then in here, such as before, we will have an input and a label. So input, I'm going to call this one form radio input this time, okay? So before it was called form input, now it's form radio input. And the type is a radio button. And then we need an ID to connect it to the label. We're going to put there next. And so the first one is for small tours. So I'm going to call it just small, okay? And now the label. And so following the same logic, form radio label. And then 4 is the ID of the input we specified, and so it's small, of course. And then here, small tour group. And now let's just go ahead and copy this one. It's large now, and again, down here and here, large tour group. And so we're good to go to check this out. And so here we go. And so now if we click this text, then the radio button here gets selected. And if we click on this one, then this one gets selected. But the problem is that the other one still stays selected here, of course. And that's because we forgot one attribute in the HTML. Okay, so in order for HTML to consider them as a group, we need to give them the same name. So it doesn't really matter here. Let's just call it size, because if it's for or small or large tours, so it's basically for the size of the tour. Okay, and so they need to have the same name attribute here. Okay, and so now either one of them can be selected, because all of the inputs with the same name, only one of them can be selected, and that's the logic behind that. And so now when you hit this one, this gets selected, and then this one. Of course, you can click on the button as well. And okay, so that's the functionality. Now in CSS, we cannot style these buttons. Okay, so these radio buttons, we have no way of styling them in CSS. And so what we have to do is to basically build our own buttons. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And we'll do that inside of these labels here. Okay, so let's do that. So right here inside of the label, I will simply add a span element and call it form radio button. And I saw that I misspelled this here again. So form radio button now. And I'm going to leave it empty, okay? So this is just for style. There's not really content in there. And okay. So this is what the button will be, all right? And we'll then hide simply this input element here, okay? So this new element here will become our button, and we will hide this input. And that is the trick. Now, since we connected the label with the input, then even if this is hidden, it will still become selected, okay? And that's the trick here. So when we click on this text here on this label, what gets selected is the input, but with our HTML, we will make it look as if this button here will become selected, while the original button is hidden, okay? And so that's the logic behind what we're going to do here. And so let's implement that. So first of all, let's style these ones here, so the radio groups, to make them side by side. So form radio group, give them a width of 50%, and then put them side by side. We could use floats now, but what I'm going to do here is to simply set their display property to inline blocks, and then therefore they will not create the line breaks and will be displayed side by side, hopefully. All right, now about the label. So radio label, let's give it a font size of 1.6, and that's actually our standard font size, if you remember. So this one here, default font size, and a cursor of pointer. So basically what this will do is to make it look like a link or something. So with this hand, so this one, this is what I mean, okay? So this hand here is showing up. Now they're not really side by side. Let me check out what's going on here. So they are actually 50%, but for some reason they're not really showing up. Let me try to decrease that. All right, so let's just put it to 49. It's really the same. Okay, it doesn't really matter. So let's just make it 49%. So I prefer this to using floats instead. All right, so we have the radio group, the radio label. Now we have the radio button here itself, okay? So this one here, as I was saying, we're gonna hide it, but let's leave that for later, okay? We'll just do that in the end. For now, let's style this radio button here. So our custom button, basically. Radio button. And this one is actually composed of two parts. Let me show that to you. So we have this green thing here outside, this circle here, and then the inside, which is this green dot, it's a different element. And that way we can either have the empty radio button like this one here, or the selected button, where we then simply display this green part here in the middle, so this dot. So it's the radio button, and then inside for the dot, we're going to create another element. But instead of doing it in the HTML, we're going to make a pseudo element. Okay? So we're going to use the after pseudo element. So first off, let's give it a height and a width so to the button. And since we want it to be a circle, it will have the same height and the same width, so both 30 pixels. Then we give it that border, that green border. So 5 pixel solid and our primary color. And then we give it a border radius of 50% in order to make it completely round. And let's take a look at that. Well, it isn't quite working yet, okay? And that is because we should make it a block element. Okay, so once again, these properties, they only work if we give it a block or an inline block element here, okay? But for now, the block should work. All right, but now what's happening is that they actually occupy this line on themselves. So yeah, inline block is probably a better option. So inline block. But still, it's now a bit difficult to actually position this element inside of the radio label element. So let's use absolute positioning in order to put it exactly where we want it to be, okay? So position absolute. And remember, in order for that to work, we have to make the parent relative. So that is radio label. So position relative. And now we should here be able to position it. So at the left, we want it to be 0. And then from the top, I'm not really sure. Let's start with 0 as well. And then we can adjust as we go. Well, that looks a bit weird. So let's inspect that. And so the problem is now that they overlap each other because, of course, the text starts at the beginning of the element, and so does the new button here. And so let's just give it some padding on the left side, and that will put the text where we want it to be. So radio label, and we're going to do 5 rem here, okay? And maybe on the top we should give it something negative, so to move it up a bit, because I saw that it was not really well aligned. And well, that wasn't quite what I wanted. So let's check out what's going on here again. And yeah, okay, no, the padding, I put the padding at the entire element and not just on the left side. So big mistake here. And now it will work. Okay, now that was maybe a bit too much, but we can decrease that. Now let's take care of that inner side that we have to put here. And so we specified this after pseudo element in order to do that. Okay, just increasing the padding here, and maybe this one here was actually well at 0. We can change that later once again. So the inner element now, how do we want to do this? Again, it's a circle, right? So let's specify its height and its width, starting with 1 rem, but we can adjust it on the go if it's not perfect. So with 1 rem, and remember that each time that we use a pseudo element, we have to actually specify its content property, and as always I set it to empty, and also the display property, and I set it to block here. And as I was saying, we want it to be a circle, so border radius 50%. Now we want it to be positioned exactly in the center of the outer circle, right? And so we're going to use our old trick for that with absolute positioning. So position absolute, and for that we need to set the position on the parent, but it's actually already set, and it doesn't really have to be relative, okay? It can be absolute as well. It just has to be specified. And so now top 50%, left 50% as well, and then the old transform trick where we translate everything minus 50%. Okay, one thing that we forgot, of course, is the background color. That should be color primary as well. And so, yeah, let's take a look now at that. And so, yeah, here we go. It's a bit too small, I think. And so let's increase that, maybe 1.3. Okay. And yeah, that looks much better. And now we're almost there, okay? So now we have to hide these little dots here so that they're empty in the beginning, just like these, right? So they have to be empty. And remember, we're gonna hide them at these ones here in the end. But for now, let's keep them there. So they have to be empty, so we simply have to make these circles here invisible. And we can then move up this entire thing here a bit to the top actually. So opacity should be 0. And here we need this one after all. Okay, so minus, maybe it should be -2 or something like that. Or maybe even more. Let's check out how much we need actually. -3, -4. Yeah, -4 looks good to me. So -4. All right, and now it's time that we have to make our magic happen. So what is that magic? Well, the magic is that each time we hit this element here, so like this or like this, we have to make the circle here, the green one, appear in the center, right? So basically put the opacity of the after pseudo element to 1. So how do we do that? Well, what we can do is to use another pseudo class, which is called checked. And that pseudo class is available on all the radio buttons, which are, as you can see here, checked. So right now, this radio button here, it has the checked pseudo class. And so we can use that to our advantage. Okay, so let's do exactly that. So radio input checked. So right now we have all the radio input elements selected, which are checked. All right. Now what we want to manipulate is not the radio input, but instead the radio button here, right? So how do we do that? Well, right now this one here is selected, but we want to select this one here. Now the thing is that this span element is not a direct child of this one here, of the radio input, right? And so what do we do? Well, once again, we use the sibling selector to first select the label, and then from there we can select this child. So this radio button here, right? So let's do that. So we select the sibling, and we can use the adjacent sibling selector again, because it is a direct sibling, but this time just to make it a bit different, let's actually use this one. It will work just the same way. And so now we select the radio label. So that is the sibling, and then we want the child element of this one, and that is the radio button. And what we really want is the after pseudo element. So this one here, right? So that is a huge selector, and I know that it's quite a complicated one, right? But it's all actually pretty logical. You just have to wrap your head around the logic that's going on here, okay? So let me try to explain it one more time. So as soon as we hit the label element, the radio input becomes checked. So we have this checked pseudo class available to us. And what we do then is to simply select the sibling of that one and then the child, because that's the one that we want to change each time that the radio input is selected. Okay? And what do we want to do? We want to give it an opacity of 1. So it was 0 and now it will be 1. Let's just add the transition here, of course. Transition. And the only one that we're really going to manipulate is opacity, and so let's actually write that out here in 0.2 seconds. Okay, so let's now check it out. And so here we go. You saw that? It actually selected the correct element. All right, and so basically now this button replaces this one. It has the exact same functionality. Okay, and this is how you style radio buttons. The same thing actually works for checkboxes. Okay. So it's the same logic. We also have the checked pseudo class available to us, and we can then go on and do the exact same manipulation. And so the last step is to actually hide the radio input element, right? So this one here, because of course we don't want to see it. So let's do it right here. Radio input. Just plain none. That's it. That's how it works. All right. And now there's just one last thing, which is to actually add this button, but that should be pretty easy, right? Because we already have the button. Now the difference here is that we cannot use an A, so an anchor element in here. But let's see that in a second. So for now, let's add another group here. And then the button. And so we already have the button, as I was saying. and also the green style of that button. Next step. Okay, so as I was saying, in a form we really need a real button element, not just an anchor link, because this button here will allow us to submit the form. Okay, so the form understands that if there's a button, then when we click that button, that should be the submit button. Okay, and we can actually also go ahead and use our write error here, like there is in the original version. And so let's check that out. And well, that doesn't really look like the one that we specified, right? And that's because this one is a button element, and so we have to actually go ahead and make some changes to our original button, but nothing really too difficult. So the first thing is that buttons, they by default come with a border, and so we should change that. So let me just add a comment here. So let's just remove that border to none. And then also we want a cursor of pointer again. So that little hand cursor. So let's see if that changed the thing. Well, actually not. Well, let me check out what's going on here. So what I'm seeing here is that the button class is actually not really getting applied here. Okay, so let's check that out. And now I see why that is actually. So these styles here, you see, these only get applied to the button with the link and the visited pseudo classes, right? Now our button doesn't have any of the pseudo classes. And so therefore nothing of this actually gets applied. And so this is great for me to show you actually the difference between a button element or an anchor tag. So the button doesn't have the link and the visited. So what we can do here is to simply do it like this, right? Because this will translate into button. So just button, so that all of these get applied to our button element as well. So that, yeah, okay, so that actually already worked here, right? Oh, and you see this blue border here around it, that is the focus. Okay, so the same focus as this one. Now, once before, as I told you in the beginning, we should not really remove simply the focus here, okay? We could go ahead and say focus outline none, but for accessibility reasons, we should not do that, okay? So let's just do something else and say that the focus should look the exact same way as the hover does, okay? Or maybe even the active, okay? Because this actually happens when we hit the button, not when we just hover it. So not here, let's take that out, but instead it should be here, okay? So we say outline none, but then instead this here happens, okay? And so we didn't completely remove that focus. And so now it's gone and everything looks great. Now just one small change here, we should add some margin to the bottom of that one. And we can simply do that in here, or actually in here, with one of helper classes. So utilities, and let's just use this one here. So just a medium space in there. Okay, so that should do the trick. Well, not really actually. Let me check. And so you see now what's going on here. And that's why I wanted to show you it in the inspector. So we have this 2rem here that we specified for all the form groups. And so that one takes precedence. It's more specific. The selector is more specific. So what can we do here? Well, I'm doing something that I said we should not do, but in the utilities classes, it is different. So when we add a utility class, we really want to happen whatever we say here in one of these classes, right? And so we actually want this to override everything else. And so what we do is to use the important keyword. So this is a normal practice to do it like this in the utility classes, okay? And so yeah, now you see that it looks okay. And actually it looks great. So let's test it again. So everything looks great. And so yeah, These buttons work as well. So it's perfect. And you saw it actually performed the action that we specified. So it went basically to this direction here, which is just to go to the top of the page. And it also reloaded it. Okay. So we successfully submitted our form. Nothing happened, of course, but that's not the point of this form. The point was to style it, and that's done, and it looks really great. So let's now move on to the next lecture, where we're going to code up the footer of this website. Welcome back. It's time to build the last remaining section in this project, which is the footer. Now this is just a very simple section, and so there is not so much to learn here anymore. But we are going to put some of the stuff we did before to practice. And don't worry, there's still a ton more to learn in the next lectures. Okay, and that is the footer. So as I said, really simple, only this dark gray background here, then this big logo going on here, and then a small navigation on the left side, in this column here, with this hover effect here, okay, and then on the right side, a simple copyright text. Okay, and that's really it. So let's start with the markup again. And now we're actually done here with the main element of our page, because what we're doing now is not anymore the main content of the site, but it's really only the footer. So it's the element footer, and I'm still going to give it a class called footer, because we're still using the BEM notation here, and in that notation, each element should get a class. And so that's what we're doing here as well. Now next up, there is that logo that I showed you, and I want to put that in a box as well. So let's create a div called footer logo box, just like we have in the header as well. And then in here goes the logo, okay, with the source of img and logo green 2 times. So it's the bigger version, but more on that later. Then here the alternative text is the full logo, and let's add a class to this one as well, and it's the footer logo. Okay, so that's the logo, and then down here we have a row. So row, and then call 1 of 2, and this 2 times. So remember this emmet notation, and so here we go. So in the first column we want that navigation, right? So let's call it footer navigation, and actually we need to put the dot here. Okay, and then usually a navigation is an unordered list with a couple of li, so list items in there. So let's do that as well. So ul, this one is simply a footer list with a list item in it. So footer item with a link in it, okay? And so this one is going footer link. All right, now the href goes to nothing, and the text here is company, okay? So we are just building this navigation. So company, contact us, careers, privacy policy, and terms. So 5 times. Actually not correct. So company, contact us, careers, and I think that's not correct. So careers, privacy, and terms. So just that we have some items in there. Okay, so that is the first column, and the second column, let's just put a paragraph in there. Footer, and here we will have the copyright text. So copyright. Okay, so let's say build by, and then a link, a footer link, okay? So we're basically reusing the ones here from the navigation. Okay, so going to nowhere, and then I just want to put my name here, okay? Just to put some text here for this online course. Of course you can do something different here. I just want to put some links here to show you an effect that I came up with, which is really cool, I think. So I'm putting some links in here. Forest online course, advanced CSS and SASS. And now I'm going to put some copyright information in here because I get this question all the time from students. And so this time I thought I'll make it very clear what you can do with this page. Okay, so copyright. And now I'm using a special entity. So it's copy by Jonas Schmettmann. So that's me. And now here's what you can do with this website, okay? So you are 100% allowed to use this web page for both personal and commercial use, but not to claim it as your own design. A credit to the original author is of course highly appreciated. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory, okay? So please go ahead and put this web page on your portfolio or whatever page you want to put it to show to some potential clients or something. So that's no problem with me. Just don't say that you designed this web page on your own, okay? So that's pretty much it, I would say. So that's it for the HTML, and let's now go ahead and actually format this. So this layout this time, right? So the footer, then of course we need to include it here. And that's not correct, so footer. Now to start, let's give it some background color. And we want something really dark here, so let's see what we have here. And this is actually not dark enough, so let's create a third one, and a 333. So this is pretty dark. Let's get the name of it. So some padding, of course, not as much as the other sections because this one is not as important, so we don't want to give it that much space. And the font size can also be a bit smaller, so we don't need this one to be as big, okay? Then we have the logo box. Okay, so we have the logo box, we have the logo. So let's prepare all of these selectors here for ourselves. We have the navigation. So navigation, we have the list, and in there we have the items and we have the links. So a lot of selectors here. I think it's actually link, right? So what do we want the logo to look like? Let's specify a width very simply of 15 rem, and then the height can adjust automatically. Okay, so let's just take a look at that. And here we are. Well, that doesn't quite look exactly as we specified, right? So let's see what's going on here. Well, maybe we didn't quite include it right here in the main. Let's take a look, layout, footer. So that should be okay. Maybe I have this error going on again in the terminal. Oh, okay, so color, gray dark, undefined variable. Ah, okay, I see there's some error there. So I didn't copy the 3. So that was the problem. Let's check it out now. And here we go. Okay, much better now. Okay, now we want this logo here to be centered, of course, in all of this, and then some space here, right? So how can we do that? What do you think? Well, I think it's actually pretty easy because the image is an inline element, and so all we have to do here is to say text align, center, and then that will center the image because an inline element behaves just like text. And then adjust the margin bottom here, 8 rem. Okay, so that should look fine now. Exactly. Okay, and now let's then do this navigation here, of course. So first the list, we don't want any list style here. So list style none. Okay, so that's enough for this. Then the items, we want them side by side, right? But not as floated elements. It's way easier to make this as inline elements. And so display inline block. And then just give them some spacing, just some right margin on all of them except the last one, as always, right? So that's nothing new for you at this point. So not last child. Now it gave me that second colon there, but no problem. So margin right, let's say 1.5 rem. And now finally, as for the links, we want the state for the link state and for the visited one. So visited, of course. And so color, we want this nice gray, so this very light gray. So this one here. So color gray light. Because white on dark always looks a bit weird. And so I try to avoid that. Okay. So the color, then the text decoration should go away. Always do that usually on links. The text transform, uppercase once again. And then I want them to be inline blocks as well. All right. And now when they are hovered or clicked, so when they're active, I want them to be green, so color primary. And they should have a bit of a shadow, so this crazy effect that I showed you before. So once again, 0, 1 rem, 2 rem. And if these values seem a bit random to you, then once again, please, I really encourage you to play around with these, okay? And 0.4 here, so a bit darker, so that we can actually see it against that, that dark background. Okay, so let's just take a quick look. And that looks pretty good already, all right? So what we had here was actually this here as well, okay? So this style. So we need a transform here, right? So how do we do that? Do you have a good idea? Well, it's very simple. We just rotate it like 5 degrees and also scale it a bit, like 1.3. Okay, and so that should be enough. All right, so let's see. This is the original one. This is ours. So, all right, looks already pretty good. Well, you see that it's like transparent, so it's here on top of the other text, so we should fix that. And then we want this, of course, the animation to happen. And you also saw that slide, this gray line here, okay? So let's put that on ours as well. So, of course, the transition, all in 2.2 seconds. And then what we need here is also this background color, okay? So background color, dark gray. So the same as the footer's background. Now about that line, that should also be pretty simple. So it should be here on the navigation, right? So border top, 1 pixel, solid, and then let's see what kind of color we can use. So let's use this light gray color here again. Okay, and now maybe some padding there as well, like to rem. Okay, actually padding top, so a space between the line and the navigation itself. So just like this. Now we only want this line to come here until this point, right? And it's also a bit too light, but that's not important. For now, what I want is that this only comes to here. So again, do you have an idea how to do that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. So what do we have to do here? Display inline block. And why does that work? Well, just because an inline block doesn't occupy 100% of its available width, only the one that the content needs. And so that will fix it. Now the color, let's put this darker one here. Okay. And so that's it. So all we have to do now is the copyright here, okay? So just the final copyright. And where is that? Yeah, here on this level. So copyright. We wanted to have the same color as the link text. So color gray light. Okay. And we can actually put that here in the top, in the footer, okay, because then this here will simply inherit that style. And then we also want this one to have this line here on top, okay, so just like this. So let's check it out. Okay, now it doesn't look very symmetric here. Okay, so let's decrease the width here of that entire thing. Okay, so if we decrease this, then it will look better. It will not 100% fix it, but let's take a look at that later. So 80%, for example. So it doesn't fix it because, well, now the empty space that we wanted is here on this side. And so finally, just say float right, and that is it. All right, so that looks better now. The animation is happening on these links here as well. And so yeah, that looks better, right? And that's it. So we designed a very simple footer with a huge logo to finish this page. So the page is now almost finished, but not exactly finished, because now there are two major things missing. The first one is this navigation here. So that's what we're going to do next. So this really great effect here. And then finally, what's also missing is this pop-up effect. So these are two things that I'll have to do, and we're going to tackle these over the next lectures. So stay tuned and see you later. So, as I said in the last lecture, the next step in our project is to build the amazing navigation that I showed you earlier. And now that you thought that I was running out of new stuff to teach you, well, I have a bunch more to show you right now. So this is what you're going to learn in this section. So first of all, the so-called checkbox hack is how this navigation works. And so you learn how that works, of course. Then you learn how to create custom animation timing functions using cubic Bezier curves. Then how to animate the solid color gradients that we talked about before to create a nice hover effect. And finally, how and why to use the transform origin property. So that's also new. Overall, you're just going to learn how to create a creative effect in CSS with about 150 lines of code. So that's what this navigation needs. Alright, so let's take a detailed look at how this navigation works. So first of all, it stays at the same place no matter where we scroll to on our page, okay? So this button always stays here. Then when we hover it, we have this effect where the lines open a bit like this, and then when you click, it becomes an X. You see? And then of course you have this huge background here coming basically from behind this button, expanding all over the page and revealing this navigation here coming in from the left side, right? So and then you have, of course, the navigation with these 5 links, and when you hover them, you have this nice effect here, okay? So, and when you close it, of course, the navigation is going to go away, and the circle will come back here to this place. All right, let's take a look at that again. Okay, so what are the main parts of this navigation? First off here, this button, of course, containing here this icon, but we'll worry about that later. Then we have this background here, which comes from here and expands, so this one. Then we have an overall container, which occupies the entire page, and which contains then this element, this unordered list, which contains this navigation. And then in there you have the li elements and a link in each of them. So just the structure of a usual navigation, okay? Now, as I was saying earlier, what makes this entire navigation work, especially the click, so when we click then the navigation opens, what makes that work is the so-called checkbox hack. So how does that work? Well, do you remember in the other lecture about the form? So down here with the radio buttons, remember this one here? So what we had here was a radio button connected to a label. And when we clicked on a label, then the radio button would become selected. Okay, and that's the same thing that we're going to do right now, but except the radio button, we're going to use a checkbox. So basically, the 3 steps for this to work is to first have a checkbox, which will be hidden later. Then second, have a label connected to that checkbox, which is where we click. And as you can guess, that will be the button here. And then the third step is to reveal the entire navigation here in the background as soon as the checkbox becomes checked, and we can use the checked pseudo class in CSS to style this. Okay, so that's how it will work. But let's do it by steps. So we first start by styling some of this stuff here, okay? So of course first in the HTML, and what we're going to do is to actually put the navigation here on top of everything else. So this will be the first element in our entire web document. And let's use a div here called navigation. Then in here we have the checkbox. Okay, so input, and I'm going to call this one the navigation checkbox. Okay, and the type will be checkbox. And the ID, which we need to connect with the label, remember, is called navi toggle. Okay, so that's the first ingredient for the checkbox hack. Then we need a label. This one will be called navigation button. And it is for the navi toggle. And in here we will later have that icon, but for now let's just say menu. Okay. Then we need a div which will be our background. So let's call it navigation background, very simple. And this one will be empty. So let's just put NBSP here, which stands for white space basically in HTML. And we used that before, right? So this background will be empty so that we can then on top of that put the navigation itself. Okay. And so for that, we can actually use the HTML nav element. Okay. And I'll call it navigation nav, very simple. And so this one will be the huge container spanning the entire page, which I mentioned, so that we can then in there vertically and horizontally center the unordered list. Okay. So navigation list, and then in there I'm going to put the navigation item. And the navigation link inside of that, and going nowhere once again. So about nature is the first one, and let's now just copy this a couple of times. Popular tours, stories, and finally book now. So that is our entire markup for the navigation. Okay, so let's now start by styling the background. Okay, that's where I'm gonna start. So the navigation is part of the layout, for me at least, and so I'm gonna put it here. So navigation SCSS, navigation here as well. Let me just copy this word here, because now we need to include it here as well. Well, there goes the copied word. But not a problem. Okay, so navigation. So let's first of all create all the selectors. So checkbox, button, and background. And then what else do we have? We have the nav, list, item, and link. So a lot of stuff to style here, as you can see. Okay, but as I was saying, let's start actually with the background. So you saw that this background is basically just a circle expanding from here, right? So if you see it very slowly, you see that it's a circle and now it comes back. And so what we need here is this circle actually behind this wider circle, okay? And that's actually why we're doing this first. So first we do the one behind this white circle and then the one on top. So let's start with sizes. So height 6 rem, width of 6 rem because it's a circle, so same height and width, and border radius 50%. So let's just take a look so that we can see what we need to do next. So all of this stuff is now right here. Okay, so we see the navigation here, we see the menu, and we see that actually when we click this here, the checkbox gets selected. Now at our div, it's still here and invisible, okay? So we need to give it that green color and then put it up here, right? So in fact, we want all of this here to be fixed, right? And to appear in the top right corner. So let's start by doing that with the button here, okay? So how do we do that? Well, we use something called positioned fixed. And that's very similar to position absolute, with the difference that with fixed, it doesn't change position as we scroll the page. But it also takes the element out of the flow and allows us to specify it in relation to a positioned element with the top, left, right, and bottom properties. So let's do that. And let's say top 6.5 rem. And you'll see where that 0.5 comes from in a second when we do the button, okay? So from the top 6.5 and from the right also 6.5. So that is nicely in the corner there. Now we want that background image with that nice gradient, right? Now this time we're going to do a different gradient, and a new one that we didn't talk about before. So we always used linear gradients, right? But now we'll use a radial gradient. And what's the difference? Well, the linear gradient goes from one side to the other one, while the radial gradient starts in the middle of an element and goes from there in all the outside directions, basically. So you will see that in a second. So we start from the lighter color. So color, primary lighter, or light, I think it's called. And then color, primary dark, okay? So we're ready to take a look at that, I think. And yeah, so here it is. But actually it's not really in the correct position, right? While it's already fixed, you see it's fixed, but not quite where we want it. So why is that? Ah, okay, I forgot the RAM here. Sorry about that one. And so let's check it out again. And yeah, so now here it goes. And you see that radial gradient now, right? Because here outside it's a lot darker than here in the middle. So that's the lighter green and that's the darker green here on the outside. Okay. Now one thing I'm noticing here is that there's probably some mistake in the HTML because these should be links, which they are not. And that is because, oh yeah, I see. So I should have put these here, of course, after this text, right? So that's a stupid mistake once again. But as I was saying earlier, it's no problem. It's completely normal that this happens. It happens to everyone. So again, okay, now it's good. Now as we scroll, you see that this gets hidden here behind that element. And so let's just quickly add a z index as well. Let's give it a really high one. So let's say even 1000, okay? And so this only works on an element which has its position defined, but it already has that, and so we're good to go. And now you see that it stays on top of everything at all the time. Okay? And now about the button. Now this one will have a white background color, okay? So color white. It will be slightly higher. We will make this one 7 rem, and of course in width as well, because it's also a circle. And we're doing that in order to really cover the background here in the beginning, okay? So if it was the same size, then maybe we would see some green of this background here behind it, but we don't want that, okay? So just to make sure, let's completely cover it. So height width, 7 rem here. Once again, we want it to be at a fixed position, okay? And then from the top, it will be at 7 rem, and from the right, the same thing, so 7 rem as well, okay? Actually, what I want is not 7, but 6, okay? So in order to cover it, because this one here is 6.5, and this one is 6. Okay, and that's because the button is 1 rem wider and higher than the background here, and that's why it's then half a rem further to the top and to the right, okay? Because this half here is half of the one difference between the size of the background and the button, okay? So they're now really on top of each other. Oh, okay, and the border radius, of course, also 50%. So let's take a look at that now. And well, I would say that here it is. What we have to do, of course, is to also give it a z-index. And this one should be really high, so even higher, let's say 2000 here. And now here we go. Now since it's white, you cannot really see it because we still have this stuff here going on sitting before our header here in the DOM, and so it makes everything white and we can see the white circle over there. So let's now actually take care of that, okay? But first of all, let's actually hide the checkbox already. So display none, because of course we never want to see this one. All right, and now the navigation element. Let me show it in the markup here for you. So it's this nav element with the navigation nav class. So remember that I said that this would be a huge element occupying the entire viewport so that we can then center the navigation list inside of that both horizontally and vertically, right? So let's now do these two steps. So first up, the nav. It should have a height of 100 viewport height units, basically, so 100% of the viewport height and the width of 100%. But I don't really need to specify that. Well, but I can for now, because it's a block level element, and so it automatically occupies 100% of its width. Now the position should also be fixed, because remember that with the navigation open, even if you scroll, the navigation will stay at the same place, okay? And so we want it at the 0 top and the 0 right. So it starts right in the top right corner of the viewport, spanning over the entire viewport because of this. And now finally, we also need to think about its z-index, okay? So this button here should always be on top, right? But the nav here should be on top of the background. And so we have 1000 here, 2000 here. And these numbers, they don't really matter as long as this one is higher as this one. And so here we can just say 1500, for example. But we could really do like 10, 20, 30. It doesn't really matter. Or 1000, 2000, 3000 for this one. But for now, what matters here is that this one here is in the middle. So let's just take a look at that. All right. And so right now we already see our white circle here sitting nicely at this place. Now all we have to do is to actually center this entire thing here in the middle. And then later on, we're gonna, of course, hide it. But for now, as we're styling it, we need to keep it visible. This UL element, so this navigation list, this is what we're gonna center inside of this nav container. So position absolute, as we already know, top 50%, left 50%, and then our transform, translate, -50 and -50, of course. We could actually write a mix-in for this part here, because we've been using it so many times, and it's always the same code. And so a mix-in would be a good thing to do here. So if you want to try it out, go to the mix-ins file here, create a mix-in like center, horizontal, vertical, something like that, and then just copy these lines, or actually these 4 lines here, and then you don't always have to write this entire code. Okay. Now in here we could actually have used left for this one, but it's really the same since it's already the entire width anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Now what we also want is to get rid of the bullets, and the text align should be center. All right. Now as we're styling this, let's actually increase the background to a huge size so that we can see how it will look like later in the real life. So the background, where is it? Okay, it's here. So what we're going to do later, as soon as the navigation is open, we will scale this entire background, okay? Like by a huge number, let's say something like 50 even. And so this entire circle will become huge and it will grow, and this animation is what will create the effect, okay? And so for now we just put it here for development purposes. We will then move it to another part of our code later on, okay? Just to take a look at it. All right, so this is how it will look like. Actually even bigger, so maybe it will have to be even like 80 or something like that to also cover bigger screens, okay? And so that's what it will look like. And you see that it already stays at the same place, right? So we're scrolling here, you see the scroll bar on the right side. I'm scrolling, and this stays at the same place. So that's great. Okay, but let's now style these links in order to make them look like this. So that's a huge difference, right? So let's now do that. And actually it's not as hard as it may look like. So let's start with the simple stuff. Font size of 3 rem, a font weight of only 300, so a nice thin text. Then the color is white, if you remember. So color white. Of course, there's no text decoration. And the text transform is again to uppercase. Okay, taking a look at that. So here we go. Maybe let's give these some padding here, and we can actually do that here in the item, or better, some margin actually. So 1 rem between the elements. So something like this here. So we're getting closer to what we have here. Now what's really different here, of course, is this white background coming in like that. So take a look at that again. So it's this slightly rotated edge again that we have in other places on our page. And so let's try to implement that here as well. And what do you think is the best way of creating this? So take a look at it again. So here you have the edge, okay? So what do you think is the best way of creating this? Well, I think it's a solid color gradient, such as we have used before. Okay, so do you remember how we do that? So background image, linear gradient, and we use a degree here. And once again, we're outside of the parentheses. Okay, and now we can use these percentages again, like we did on the booking section, right? So let's start with transparent. And actually, to make it visible, let's get out our favorite orange red, which at 0% it is orange red, okay? Then at 50%, it's orange red again, only to say that at 50% we start our color white. 50%. Okay, now without any animation and anything like that, let's just take a look at what we have here. And okay, so that's the starting point really. And so before we move on, let's give this here some padding, okay? So padding, once again, on the top we have 1, and on the sides then a bit more, okay? That always looks good. And now I'm going to show you another property that's not exactly new, but I'm not sure if you're aware of it, and that's called background size. So background size, and yes, of course you're aware of it because we've used it before. Actually, I showed it to you with background size 100%, right? So 100%, that's the starting point here. So let me show it to you what happens if we increase that value in this case. So you start with 100, and if we increase this, you see that the entire thing basically moves to the right side. And that's because we're basically increasing the entire thing, but it's not visible because the box ends here. But you can imagine that now this entire background goes like around this entire thing here, okay? And if we set this all the way to 200, which is double, okay, so 200, now it will go all the way until in here, okay? So basically like here. So now this entire thing here is the gradient, but we only see the red side, right? So only the red part of this gradient is visible, but we know that the white part is still here on the right side, right? And the same thing of course applies to all of these. So all of these have this white part now here going on that right side. And maybe now you can start to see how this effect is going to work, right? Because now all we have to do is to move this entire gradient here to the left side, and then the white part will be here, and the red part, which later will be transparent, will be here on the left side, okay? So if you basically shift the entire thing 100% to the side, then we end up with the effect that we're looking for, right? So let's now implement that. And actually in here, this is not correct because this should be for the link pseudo class, right? And also for the visited, since we're at that. So this is for the normal state, and then the hover and active state. So remember what I was saying? If we shift the background completely to the left side, then we end up with the effect that we want. And we can do that with background position. Okay? And so the entire thing, as we were saying, usually means 100%. All right? And just so that we can see it, let's actually animate it. So transition all 0.4 seconds. So let's take a look now. Well, what's going on here? Oh, okay, I didn't change it in the code. Here it's still 100. I changed it only in the DevTools, but of course it doesn't reflect in the code. And so now it works. And you see, as we're hovering it, the background basically shifts to the left side because the position is now at 100%. And let me show that to you here in the inspector as well. So I can say hover, and then we can here take the number and play a bit with it. So you see, when I decrease it, it goes back to where it was. So 0 was the initial state, basically. And so now, as I increase it, it goes in this direction. And as I increase it even more, it goes around like this, but that doesn't matter, okay? So 100% here basically is the end. But anyway, 0 is what we actually wanted. So let's take that away and hover it. Well, what's going on now? Ah, yeah, right. Now you see that it's not quite right, okay? And that's because of this 100%, because of this 120 degrees here. So we rotated this thing a bit, and so it doesn't quite cover here the entire thing. And so what we want to do is to just increase this a bit here, okay? So just set it to 220%, and that should fix it. So you see, now it's much better. All right, and of course we now want to replace that with transparent, because orange red is always just our testing color. All right, so transparent, and here we go. Now of course we also need to make our text dark so we can actually see what's written in there. So color, and then color primary. All right. Now another thing that we had going on here actually, let's take a look at that. Okay, so anyway, this works now, right? Now another thing that we have going on here is you see that it slightly moves a bit to the right side. Okay, and that looks even better this way, right? So let's do that as well. And that's pretty easy, of course, you know that already. So translate X, and let's say just 1 rem. All right. So that's the original, and that's ours here. And, well, it doesn't really work. Why is that? Maybe there's an error again here in my terminal. But actually no, it seems to just be working just fine. So what's happening? Well, this animation actually works just fine, but for some reason the transition is not working out. So let's put this to hover here again. And yeah, actually it is here. But it's not doing anything. And I think I know why this is happening. And actually I was wondering why the padding was also not being applied just right. And that's because we still have to define these here as inline blocks, okay? So the link should be, of course, let me put it at the beginning. I like to put it at the beginning always. So display, it should be an inline block, so that the padding is actually really applied the way it should. Okay, yeah, now it looks much better. And also it works the way we intended it to. So here we go. Much better now. All right, well, this one here also has these numbers. So let's just add a span because we also have the spacing here. So this is just a simple span that I added. It's nothing really important, but nevertheless, let's do that. Okay, so it's just a span element saying 01. And now I'm breaking the rule here of every element having to have a class. but, well, I would say that rules are meant to be broken sometimes, okay? So as long as you have a good reason, then that's okay. And in this case, that's because I think it would be really kind of an overkill to now add even another class to that chain, okay? And so in here, all we have to do is to say span, because it's inside of these link elements here, right? And so margin right 1 rem and display inline block. So that should do it. And yep, here we go. You can even make it a bit more like 1.5. Yeah, that looks really good. All right, now the problem is that of course nothing of this works. We don't have the icon here, and so we have to take care of all of that, making the checkbox hack actually work, and we're going to do that in the next lecture. So don't wait and comment me right there. So here comes the more exciting part of building this navigation, which is to actually make it work as soon as we hit that navigation button. So let's do that. So first of all, we need to hide this background here again and also hide this navigation, right? So let's do that. Where is this? Yeah, here. So remember, we didn't want this one here. So let's make it disappear. And then here we have the button. And actually, we should add some shadows here, okay? So a box shadow of 1 in the Y direction, a nice blur, and then a color of, once again, black, right? So just a very subtle shadow here, right? So that's what it looks like. And now, of course, we have to get rid of the navigation here as well. So where is that? Yeah, this is the one. So how are we going to do that? Well, we can use opacity 0, such as we did before. Now there's a problem with that, which is that with this alone, we will actually make it opaque. But you see that, well, now I cannot show you, but the links, okay, they're still here. So you see that the hand is here at some of these places. So they are invisible now, but they are still there. So what we should do here is to also set the width to a 0. And actually we have it up here. So let's remove that. And so now it should work just fine. So the text is now gone. The only text we have here now is this H1 that we have. Okay, so we hit the navigation and we hit the background. Now all we have to do is to actually bring them back to life, let's say so. And so this is where we use the checkbox hack. So how do we do that? Remember from the booking lecture where we did the radio buttons? So this is very similar to that. So we have our checkbox, we have our label, and we have our background. So we hit the label and the checkbox becomes checked. And then we want the navigation background here to become visible. So how do we translate that into a CSS selector? Well, it's actually not so hard. We just write checkbox and a checked pseudo class again, just as we did with the radio button. And then we use the sibling selector. Remember that one? Now this time it's not an adjacent sibling because it's not the direct sibling, right? So the one that we want to select here is now this one. And so the adjacent sibling of the checkbox would be this one, but that's not the one that we want. We want this here. And so we just use the general sibling, and then with that we will be able to select the right element. So background. And that's actually it. So remember how we increased the size of this? We simply scaled it 80 times. This is what we actually did. Okay, so let's see if that works. So we hit this. And whoa, here we go. And now it disappears and it comes back and it appears. And so it is working. Great, right? We don't have the animation yet in place, but we're going to take care of that in a second. But for now, let's do the same with the navigation, okay? So it's the same really. And so all we have to do here is to replace it with nav. And then what happens here is of course that we remove what we did here before. So the opacity is no longer 0 and the width is no longer 0 as well. So opacity 1, width back to 100%. So let's take a look at that. And here we go. So it works without the animation, but it works. And so for the animation, this is also very simple. It's just the transition that we have used before. So we need a transition on the background as well as on the nav element. So transition. And what we want to transition here is just a transform. So let's just put transform here instead of transitioning everything. And then let's put in 0.8 second here. So a very long one. Now this time around, we're going to add a custom transition timing function here. For now, let's just add the transition to the other element and just take a look how it looks like, okay? And so here, transition. And in here, we only want to really animate the opacity, okay? So the width, it should be instantaneous. So instantly, it should become 100%. But the opacity, that's the one that we want to actually animate. And so we say opacity and also 0.8 seconds. All right, and that should be enough already. All right, and well, actually we have to animate the width as well, because now you see it goes here like to this side in this weird way, right? So let's put it here to all, right? Well, now you see this is like weirdly moving in from the side and moving out like this, okay? And that's not at all what we want to happen, but I believe that this is because we didn't specify a width here for this element. So for this list, okay? So if we set this to 100%, then that should not be happening. So navigation list, okay? And we say width 100%. Let's reload that. Well, and it actually makes sense that this is happening. Because remember, when we close this entire container here reduces its width from 100%, so everything, all until the way to 0. And since we fixed it here at the right side, then this thing here also moves to the right side, okay? Let me demonstrate that to you. So first of all, let's put it to left here, okay? We want this to move to the left. At least that will make it look a bit better. And then background color, and you can guess it, orange, red. So let's take a look at that right now. So this is what happens, you saw? And now when I hit this button, you will see this orange here moving to that side. And so therefore, since this here is always centered in this container, it will move to that side. So you saw that? Okay. And so that's what happened. But that's actually not a big problem, because basically this automatically gives us a nice animation effect, right? So this box moving in like that. Now I promised you that we would take care of a custom transition timing function, okay? So here and here as well. So let's now do that. So we saw in other lectures that there are a bunch of built-in transition timing functions, like ease in or ease out or ease in out. But this time we want to use our custom one. And for that one, we use something called cubic Bezier functions. Okay. Now in here we have to put 4 numbers that define the cubic Bezier curve. But since we don't really know which numbers to put, there's a nice tool which can help us with that. And actually 2 tools, because this one and this one. So here are a bunch of different functions that we can use. Now again, what an easing function is basically a function that specifies how much a change occurs over time, okay? And that's exactly what this is here. So take a look at these red markers. So this one started slow, accelerated, and then slowed down again. Take a look again. And this one here makes it even more, and even more in here, you saw. So really slow beginning, then really fast, you see this here, and then really slow. Then we have these ones here, something like this. But for now, let's use this one here, okay? I really like this one. So we're going to use that for the background. So we can just click this here, and then all we have to do is to copy this curve. You put it here, or actually we only need the numbers. Already wrote the function, and so we just need the numbers. And now let's take a look at how it looks like. Well, that was different, right? So just as in the example, it comes really easy and then it accelerates like crazy. You saw that? So let's stick with that. And of course you can use other functions. If you like another one more, use that. And just to have this more visually, this is how these functions actually work, so these numbers. So if we push these here or pull them down, then we have something like this. So this is a bit similar to the function that we have, right? Well, maybe not exactly like this. Well, I'm not sure, it doesn't really matter. But in here we can then compare these cubic Bezier functions that we draw here with one of the built-in ones. Okay, so if we hit on go, then the pink one is the one that we wrote in here, and the blue one is the built-in. So for example, the ease in out, let's say. If we compare it with this one, then you see this one is really slow at the beginning and at the end, but then it's really fast. And that's like this huge slope that you see here going on. Now, if you did it the other way around, something like this, you'll now see that it will accelerate pretty fast, then it will slow down, move actually back a bit, and then become really fast again at the end. So let's take a look. And you saw that moving back, it was this part here. So from here to here, it moved back and then really fast at the end. Let's take a look again. There it is. And yeah, so you can really like play around with this. And now this will be even more dramatic. Okay, so there's a lot of different functions that we can draw basically with this. So let's take a look now at this one, for example. So I really like to play around with this. So now in this case, we already have these predefined functions here, which are pretty great, but you can always, if you want, play around with this one. Now for the navigation itself, let's add another function. And the one I'm going to use is this one. And so this one, as you can already see here, it will move out a little bit. So let's actually copy the entire thing here now, because in here we haven't put it already. All right. So let's take a look now, refresh. And here we go. And so now you saw that it actually moved a bit to that side first, so to the right side. And why did that happen? Well, simply because this width, so this 100% width here, it got a bit larger. So it got maybe 110% because of this curve. So because the curve here actually comes out of this one here, let's say. So we have something like this, right? And so you will see that this now will probably move a bit out here actually like this. So you saw it's moved a bit in this direction, then it came back. And that's because this here is higher than the 100%. Actually, it says here 105%. And you can see it here as well. It says this curve contains values out of range. And that makes for this effect, which can be really cool sometimes. And in this case, I think it looks good. And so let's keep it that way. But of course, I invite you to play around with this, get your own style maybe, and yeah, play around with this, okay? All right, so this is already pretty similar to what we have here. All that's left to do is to actually create this button here. So these three lines, which open and close and close and open. Okay, that's actually a bit more complex than it looks like. And so we're going to leave that for the next lecture. So if you want to know how to do it, don't take a break and come right with me. Okay, see you in a second. In the third and final part of building the navigation, we're going to code up that nice button that is still missing from our navigation. So this is what it looks like. And this is basically composed of these three lines. So this line here in the middle, it will be simply a small span element, okay? And then this one here will be a before pseudo element, and this one will be an after pseudo element. So instead of putting three same elements in the HTML, we just put one, and then we use pseudo classes to make the rest. Okay, and then when we click, well, you see that the one in the middle disappears, and then the other one rotate in order to form this cross. And that's it. Well, it looks easier than it is, but we can still do it, of course. So back in the HTML, this is where it will be. Okay. So we're going to have a span called navigation icon. And it will be empty. So let's just put this NBSP there again. So navigation icon. So let's add some comments in here. Icon. Then here let's say the functionality. And so yeah, let's put then the icon down here. All right. As I was saying, we are going to create a before and an after pseudo element. And there are some styles that all of the three will share. So let's start with these for now. So the icon element itself, then the before pseudo element, and the after pseudo element as well. So these three will have a width of 3 rem and a height of only 2 pixels, okay? And here we use pixels because we don't want this to change. It will always be 2 pixels no matter what the base font size should be. And then very simple, the background color will be some nice dark. So let's get that actually. So the darkest one that we have, and that is this one here. Okay, now remember that in order for the before and after pseudo elements to actually appear on the page, they need to have their content property defined. So let's do that. Content, and once again it will be empty. Now they also need to have their display property set, and we can do that in here because we want all of them to be inline blocks for obvious reasons, right? All right, let's just take a look. It will not look really good for now, but well, it's a kind of a start, okay? So let's continue. Well, maybe actually let's see which one is which. So if we inspect this one, then this one here is the span. Okay, so the first one is the span and the other two are the after and the before pseudo elements. I'm not really sure why they are located where they are, but well, that doesn't really matter, okay? So how are we going to position these? Well, I suggest we just use absolute positioning. So position absolute. And then on the parent one, well, it's actually not here. So the parent one is just the icon. So that's the parent element. So we need to specify the position here as well. And this one is relative. And so, yeah, so the before and the after, they are then positioned in relation to the span element, so to the icon element itself. Now they should be 0 from the left, and then we want 1 at the top and 1 at the bottom. Okay, so let's do that. So 1 for each. So before, let's just say top minus 1 rem, so to move it up basically. And then the other one, the after, top 1 rem, so to just move it down. So let's take a look now, and all right, that looks a lot better already. And we see that the one in the middle is the span element. Now, if we want to now center this horizontally, then we can simply set the text align property here to center on the navigation button, right? So let's do that one. Text align center. And then all we have to do is to just move down all of this a little bit. So we just have to give it a margin top here of 3 rem, let's say. Oh, and that looks pretty good already. Maybe 3.5 rem. That's excellent already. So it's really nice in the center. So it looks like this already. Well, this one here is a bit closer, so the lines are closer. So let's do that as well. So minus 0.8 and 0.8 here as well. So just 8 pixels. So 1 or 2 pixels can make a huge difference sometimes, as we just saw. All right, so that's for the styling. Now we want, first of all, this to happen when we hover it. Okay, so these move a bit up. And actually also this hand cursor here, right? So the pointer is not happening right here for obvious reasons. And so let's do that as well. And that is here. So cursor, pointer. All right, and that will fix that one. And now we want, as soon as we hover the button, these lines to space out a little bit. So how do we do that? Well, it's not difficult. Let's simply select the button, of course, because that's where we want to hover. So button, hover, and then from there we can select the icon. And actually we want the pseudo element before. So we can do it this way because the icon is of course a child element of the button, right? So the button and the icon. So it's a child element, so we can just select it like this. Very easy. All right, and so what we want to animate here is actually the top property. All right, so it was minus 0.8 here. So let's put it as -1 now. And then the same thing actually for the after. So after, and now 1. And then of course we need to transition all of this. So transition all in 0.2 seconds. All right. Now I could have done all of this here with translate maybe instead of top and absolute positioning, but it's all right. It's absolutely no problem. As long as it works, different tools will do the same job. Okay. Well, let's close this one here. And yeah, so that looks really nice. Okay. So that's our functionality already. And so all that's left to do is to now basically rotate these two here to form a cross and make the one in the middle disappear. Let's start actually with that. So making that one disappear. And that shouldn't be so difficult as well, right? Now, when does this actually happen? Well, this is back to the checkbox hack, right? So when the checkbox is checked, then we want something to happen. And what do we want to happen? Well, we want to select here this button, right? And this button is a sibling, and it's actually an adjacent sibling. And so we can use the plus here. But before we have to fix that. So we can use the plus because it's an adjacent sibling. And then button. And from there we can then select the child element again, such as we did up here. So the icon in this case. So got that? When the checkbox is selected, then we select its brother, basically, which is called the button. And then we select the button's child, which is the icon. All right. So again, the same logic with the checkbox hack that I explained you before. Okay, this one we want to disappear. Now we don't want to really change its size. Okay, so this element has a size, but the after and the before pseudo elements, they depend on this size, right? They're positioned in relation to that size. And if we now remove that size, so if we would remove the width and the height of this element, then we would change the positions of the before and after, and we don't want that. And so we will keep it very simple, and all we do here is to change the background color to transparent. So you see we've been using transparent a lot of time, and that's because, well, sometimes that is very handy, just to make an element invisible like that. Okay, so that's the first step. And we're getting closer. So next up, we do the same thing here with the after and the before. So before, well, not this, of course. And the after. So what do we with these actually? Well, as we said, we are going to rotate them. So transform, rotate, and basically it looks like they're 45 degrees rotated, right? So let's rotate one 45 degrees in one direction and the other one in the opposite direction. Okay, and so if they rotate in opposite directions, they should create this cross. So let's take a look at that. And well, kind of. Okay, so not really there yet, but it's starting to work. Now, why is it not working? Well, it's because of two factors. First up, we should move them to the middle. Okay, so now they're still spaced out in relation to the one in the middle. So we should move them back to 0. So a top of 0. And the same for this one here. So this is actually a lot of like experimentation and stuff. So I really had to experiment around in order to make it work. So don't think that you have to actually be able to code up all of this really quickly like I'm doing here, because that's not the reality, okay? So usually we have to try out some things, try our different tools, but that's exactly why we have these tools, so that we can use them, so we can test them and then find a final solution. And that's what I did here. And so now that's the one that I'm showing you. And all right, so it already looks pretty good, right? Now I want to make this a little bit better. So you see now they are basically just moving down like that. See that again? But here it looks a bit cooler. So they rotate a bit more. So let's do that. And what we're going to do here is to rotate them 180 degrees minus 45. Okay, so 180 degrees is half a rotation. And if we subtract 45 from that, we end up basically with not a quarter of a circle, which is this one, but 3/4. And so let's do that. So 180 minus 45 is 135. And so this is just a small nuance that I'm adding here. So it's basically the same. Oh, that's the one. And so here we go. That's it. That's really it. So it's working now, and it's working great, and it looks beautiful, and it's really fantastic. Now I promised to show you another property which I didn't really show you because I'm actually not needing it. And that one is called transform origin. And what that does is basically it describes where the transformation happens. Okay, so let me show that to you. For example, here in one of these. So just the before one. So transform origin. And believe me that sometimes this can be useful. Let me just put right here, okay? And I will make this animation a bit slower so we can see what's going on here better. And so that's what happens when you say that the origin of the transformation should be at the right side. So let's take a look at that again. So you see what happens? I said that it should be on the right side. And so what this does is that the center of the rotation is on the right side of the element. You see that? Well, it doesn't quite look like it because we're also at the same time moving it to another position, okay? Because of this top transformation that is happening right here as well. So let me take that out. And this is just to show you, okay? We will put it back in a bit. And now you can see it even clearer, especially on this one here. You see? So this stays at the exact same place. Well, actually, this is the only one where I've changed it, right? So it should only be happening here. So this is here the right side of the element, and the rotation happens now around this point. So take a look again. So you see, it stays there. Let's put it to the left side now, just to take a look. And so remember, I only did this at the before, so the after doesn't matter here. So let's put it at left. And this is what it looks like then. So now it will probably be around this point here, right? So let's see. And yes, so actually that is what happens. And so sometimes when we rotate something, for example, this can be really helpful in order to rotate it exactly where we want it. Well, if we don't specify it at all, then it's basically just in the center. That's what you can observe here. It basically rotates around this point here in the center. All right. So just to show you another property, which can be helpful in times. Put this one here back. And I think that was it. Okay, yeah. I also have to change here the speed. And here we go. So that's it. That's our animation. Really fine, really great. Now, all we have to do really to finish this project, well, at least the first part of the project, because we have a second part coming up. But to finish this entire project, what we have to do is this. So this very nice pop-up here, This is what we're going to do over the next couple of lectures. Hello and welcome to building the very last part of the Nators project, and that is the pop-up that I showed you before. So in this lecture, you'll learn how to build a nice pop-up with only CSS, and this time we're not using the checkbox hack for that functionality, but instead we're using the target pseudo class. But with this pop-up component, I don't only want to show you how this actually works, but I'll also teach you how to create boxes with equal height using display set to table cell. Plus, I want to give you some tools for text formatting, like creating column layouts and automatic hyphenation of words using the new hyphens property. Let's start by taking a detailed look how this pop-up actually works. So you open the pop-up by clicking on one of these Book Now buttons here that appears on one of these cards. Okay, so when we hit, we see that the background here basically becomes dark, right? And we also see that this box here basically coming in, so with a nice animation. And of course, all of this is on top of the entire web page. So even of the navigation button. You can maybe see it here, it's hidden behind this complete pop-up. And also this is at a complete fixed position, so we can scroll, and maybe you can see that as well in the background. Alright, so I'm scrolling up and down, but this pop-up here stays in the same place. So we have an element which fills this entire part here, so the entire viewport, and then in there we have this box here, which is the pop-up itself. Okay, so let's start by coding that up in our HTML. And we can actually put this wherever we want on our markup because it's not really tied to any of the sections or anything. So let's just put it here really at the end of everything, okay? So even after the footer, let's say. And so it's just a div, and I'm going to call it pop-up. Okay, and so that is for that dark background. And then in there we have the box itself. So pop-up, and let's call it content. So it's the content of our pop-up. All right, just writing pop-up here, because for now we're going to leave this one empty, and we'll just focus on styling that background and that box. So in order to make it look exactly like this. And that is actually the challenge that I have for you. So I want you to style this background and then position this white box here exactly where it is right now. And as you can imagine, it will always stay here nicely centered. So no matter what we do with the viewport, it always stays nicely centered. Okay, and so I want you to code that in CSS. And so pause the video now and do that. So hopefully you did that. So let me do it right now in order to show you. So I create a new file here, and this is, I think, the last file that we're ever going to create. So that's good, right? So pop-up as CSS, of course. And don't forget it to include. All right, close it. And here we go. So pop-up, and we also want the content. So the height should be 100 viewport heights, right? So 100% of the height. The width should be 100%, which is actually maybe not really necessary, but let's keep it here. It's not a problem of having one line of redundant CSS. Okay, so let's keep this here. Then, as you know, the position is, well, it is fixed. Okay, so it doesn't move as we scroll. And then we can use top and left and all that stuff in order to position it. Top 0, left 0. So just like absolute positioning, it's taken out of the flow. Okay, now the background color, let's make it a slightly transparent black. Okay, so color black, let's say 80%. Okay, so that should now occupy the entire viewport. Let's take just a look at that. And yeah, so here we go. Well, actually not really what we want, because it's still here on top of this button, right? So we give it a really high z-index in order to fix that. So something like this, and that should help. All right, you see, so now it's really on top of the entire page. Okay, and now as for the content, let's start by giving it a width of, let's say, 75%. So it's going to occupy always 75% of the container and therefore of the viewport as well. Let's give it a nice background color. And actually not really nice, it's just white, okay? So color white. And actually I will also give it a height here, but only for testing purposes, okay? So we did that before, and so let's do it again. So 50 rem here again, and I'm gonna get rid of that later. Also, we want some box shadow. So 0, let's say 2 rem, and 4 for the blur. And of course, color black. Let's say 0.2. Okay, and now the positioning of this element inside of the pop-up. Well, once again, we're using absolute positioning here. And now this time, let me actually create a mix in here because I'm a bit tired of always writing this out. Okay, and so you should do the same. Maybe you already did because I've talked about this before. So I'm going to call this one absolute center, okay? And so all that's going to do is to simply add position absolute, top 50%, left 50%, and then transform, translate, minus 50% and minus 50%. Okay, and so now we have this reusable piece of code that we can now insert here wherever we want. And I like to do that at the beginning, actually. So include abs center. So that stands for absolute center. Now I could go ahead and open up all of these files and replace all of this code in each time where we have used it. But I'm not going to do that in order not to waste your time, okay? But for you, I think it's something that you should do in order to make your code look a bit cleaner. Okay, so let's now take a look at that. And all right, so that looks pretty good already, right? It's pretty similar already to what we have in our original. Just some rounded corners here missing, but beside that, we're good to go. So what's next here? Well, we have basically this left side here with these two images, and then the right side with this text and this button and this H2 element here, right? And here on this right side, so like this right panel here, we have this entire content like vertically centered. And that is because these boxes here, they're actually the same size. So this here is a box and this one is a box, and they have the same height. And so I told you before that that's something that I want to show you. So how to make two boxes side by side having automatically the same height. So that can be very useful sometimes, and it's something I haven't showed you up until this point. So let's create this content in here, okay? But first, these rounded corners that we were missing. So border radius 3 pixels. All right. Now coming back to this pop-up here, I'm going to call this one pop-up, simply for the left side, and then for the right side, of course. Okay, so in here we have some pictures. So img, then img net 8, and this is simply a tour photo. Okay, then again, and this time it's img net 9, and another tour photo. Okay, also I should give them a class. So pop-up img. Okay, and as for the left side, we want a heading secondary here, right? So it's an H2 heading secondary, and this one says start booking now. Then below that we actually have an H3, so that we called heading tertiary. Important. Then I'm using like a long dash, and that's something that I like to use, so I'm going to show it to you. So this is another one of these HTML entities that I use all the time. And then just something like, please read these terms before booking, okay? Now in a real life scenario, it would probably not be a good idea to ask the client to first read the terms before booking, right? But in this page here, we're not really worried about that kind of stuff. I just created these parts of the websites and these features in order to show you all of these CSS features, okay? So don't just copy what I have done on this web page. It's not optimized for conversions or for anything like that, okay? So this is just to show you these CSS features again. All right, and finally, just some pop-up text here in a paragraph. All right, now let's get some text here from one of these lorem ipsum generators that I've already opened here. I think I showed you this one before. And I'll just say that I want it to generate one paragraph for me. So here we go. And I copy all of it and paste it here. All right. So that's a long line of text. Now actually I also want a button here, okay? So a dot button and button green, pointing to nowhere, at least for now. Okay, so book now. All right, so let's now format these. So left, right, image, and text, okay? Left, right, image, and text. So let's actually start with the images, because otherwise they will occupy a lot of space and then we cannot see what's going on, okay? So I want these images to be displayed as a block. That's usually a good idea to do. And then I want them to have a width of 100%. So entirely their entire parent container's width, right? Now another thing that I should actually do here already is getting rid of this height. Remember, it was just for testing purposes. And so, yeah. Now the left part here, we wanted to have a width of 1/3. So basically 33.33333%. And it's not an exaggeration to put such a high amount of these numbers here after the comma, okay? So we can totally do that. And so this one should be the reminder of that. So 66.6666667, for example. 6 would also be okay, so it's not really important here. What matters is that these two roughly together make 100%. So let's take a look at that. Of course, it will not be really good, because now we want these side by side. And the first thing that comes to mind for doing that is to actually use float, right? So let me start by showing that to you. So float left and float left. Could be right as well, but it doesn't really matter because they have 100% together anyway, so that's not a difference. Okay, and now they're side by side, such as we wanted. But let me show you the small problem with that. So it's not really a big problem, but you see here that this left element has this entire height, and then the right one only has this height. Of course, because that's the space that it occupies. So that's completely normal behavior. Now what we want here is that these boxes actually have the same height, because then it's easier to center this content here vertically in the middle of all of this white space here, okay? And so sometimes that's a very useful thing to do and a very useful technique that I'm gonna show you, okay? So let me actually show you how to do that. So it's not using floats, but instead we're gonna simulate a table, okay? And so we set the display property on this one here to table cell. So on both of them, display table cell, and then the parent element, which is, remember, the content. So this one here, we set this one to display table, okay? And so this one functions as a table, the content, and then the left and the right, they are both table cells. And then the browser will automatically give them the same height, okay? So let's take a look at that. And well, for now it still looks the same. So content left and right, but you see that they now both basically here have the same height. And now all there's left to do is to use a property that we can use on tables, or on table cells actually, and this is called vertical align middle. Okay, so let's take a look at that now, and here we go. And so now we have two table cells basically, where this one here has its content aligned in the middle of the other table cell basically. Okay, So let's take a look at that here. All right. And so the height is actually still only 542. So only this blue box that you see here. And so technically they do not have the same height, but we can consider that they do, because when we use this vertical align, then they nicely align here like this. And of course there are others instead of middle. There is like top, okay, and so it works the same. And also bottom, I believe. Yep. And so we can do this kind of thing basically by faking that this is a table. Because if it was a real table, we would have to use the HTML elements for all of that. But by setting it using the display property, we are basically faking and saying that this is a table, while in fact it's not. Okay, so let's continue now formatting this, giving it here some nice padding. Actually, this is misspelled here. And another thing that I'm seeing here is that these images here overlap the border radius that we gave here, this one here, right? And so let's fix that as well. So do you remember how we do that with the image overlapping the border? Well, we did it before and it's not really difficult. All we have to do is come to the content here and say overflow hidden. And so that part of the image, which is overflowing this box, will not be visible anymore. And yep, maybe you saw it changing here. And so now it's gone and it works just fine. All right, now about the padding here in this right thing. Some padding at the top. And then on the sides, some more. So 5 rem in here. Then about the text, let's give it some font size of 1.4 only. 1.4 rem. And also margin at the button in order to create that space between the button and the text. Just making the word look right. And so here we go. Okay, so that looks pretty nice already. Let's just add some more spacing here to these two. And for that we can use our helper classes. So margin bottom, and I'm going to use the small and the medium one. Okay, so for the secondary heading we can add it in here, the medium one, and then here small. So that should look better. Or maybe, well, maybe not. We can put the small one here as well. Now it looks more consistent. Now one last piece missing here in the puzzle to make it look like this one. So where is it? To make it look a bit more like this one is these columns that we have here. And also this automatic hyphenation that I mentioned in the beginning. So you have a word and then here's not enough space for it. And so there's a hyphen and it continues on the next line. And actually if you select it, it selects both parts. So that's really nice as well. So if we decrease this here, then we see that even more hyphens start to pop up as we have less and less space to fit the content here. So that's a very nice and new feature in CSS. And so let us take a look at that actually, okay? So back to our CSS and let's start with the columns. So column layout is something really new in CSS, but we can make it work in most of the modern browsers already. So all we have to do is to specify a property called column count. Okay, so we say that we want 2 columns, and so that's all we have to do. And with this, it will automatically create us 2 columns. Now there are some more details that we can do here, which is column gap. Okay, and so in here we can specify the space that we want between the columns. Okay, and the default here is 1em, but we want it to be a little bigger here. Just for curiosity, what would be 1em here in this specific case? Can you think about that? So what would be the default for the column gap if that's 1em? And I hope you guessed it right. It would be 1em 14 pixels. Okay? And why is that? Well, because 1em is always the font size of the current element. Okay? So just as a reminder, so you don't forget what this m here actually means. But in this case, we just want to set it to 4 rem so that we give it some more breathing space. Okay, and then another interesting property here is the column rule. So this is basically just like a border, which will be exactly in the middle of these 2 columns, okay? So the browser will automatically put it there. And so let's put a light color here. So color gray. And now I don't really remember the color names here. So let's simply put this one here. So the number 2, and where is it? Actually, we can close this one here and the mix in as well. So color grade 2 here. All right, so let's take a look now. Maybe reload it. And well, nothing happened for some reason. Let's inspect that. So pop-up text. Well, it's not really there. Why is that? Well, everything should be okay. So let's try to reload this one more time. But for some reason, it's not really there. So this looks like maybe there was some kind of error here again. And okay. So color grade 2 does not exist. Why is that? Oh, okay. Probably I misspelled it. Let's just get it here, copy it. Ah, okay. I forgot to call it light. All right. And so usually when something doesn't appear on the page, well, then it's most likely a SASS compilation error. Okay. So that happens to us a couple of times now, but now it is finally working. Okay. And so here it is. So here are our two columns and our nice line here separating these two. Okay. So let me show you what happens if we decrease the gap. And so at 0, of course, these two sides, they are then touching. And we could increase the count, of course. So 3 columns, 4 columns, 5 columns, and so on and so forth. So what you see here is the CSS automatically balances the height here of these columns. So you see that in the first column and the second column, they have the same height as they still have enough text to display. And then the last one here, where the text ends, well, then the rest of the column here is, of course, empty. And if you increase that, you will see the same thing happening so that the text is always nicely distributed here. Okay. Now I think we have a bit too much text here, so let's get rid of part of that. So this looks a bit weird right now. So maybe this part here, where is that? All right, so that should be better. And now the final thing that we want to do here is the hyphenation, and that one is really easy as well. So hyphens, and then there are 3 possibilities here. So the first one is none, which is basically the initial value, so the default. Then we have manual, so we could say manual, but that's not really useful, because if we say manual, then we can go to our text and automatically specify where we want hyphens to occur. So we can do that then here in our text and specify places where we want that to occur. But I think that's not helpful at all. And so I think the only thing that matters here for this hyphens property is to actually use auto. Okay, and so it will automatically figure out where to place the hyphens. Now, in order for this to work correctly, you have to actually define the document language here. So up here in the HTML, you have this language attribute, and in here, just set it to English if your website is English, and to your language if it's not. So you can just Google the code that you have to put here for your language. Okay. Now in this case, this is not really English. This is probably Latin or something. But you see that the hyphens are already working. Okay. So they are here in this word, in this one. And so yeah, so this is working already. And these two properties together, so the columns and the hyphens, this allows us to get closer to the traditional print designs, like a magazine layout or a real newspaper. And so that's why these properties were introduced. And you see that it also nicely changes here, the hyphenation and everything, as the width changes. And so yeah, this is already nicely responsive actually. Okay, so just one thing that I have to tell you in the end is that this actually needs a lot of prefixes in order to work in all the modern browsers. So we should give it a MOZ prefix. Let's actually copy this. So for Mozilla, for Microsoft, so for Edge, and also for WebKit, which is basically Chrome and Safari. Because in some older versions, it will not work without this, okay? And actually the same thing here applies to the columns. So here we should have at least the Mozilla prefix, okay? So in Mozilla, it's not going to work without this prefix. And so we should add it. Now, we are now doing this manually just because I want to show you that you need these prefixes. But in the real life, you should not do it by hand. But instead, there are nice tools that you can use in order to do that. And one of them is called Auto Prefixer. But I'm going to talk a bit more about that later on in the course, okay? So for now, just remember that usually you shouldn't add the prefixes by yourself I'm just putting them here now so that you know which property is supported in which browser. All right, and so I think we now have the styling part here complete. And so in the next lecture, let's then take care of the functionality. So basically opening and closing this pop-up, right? Because that's what's really missing in here. So let's move on now to that next lecture. To finish this section of the course, let's now take care of the functionality of the pop-up that we just built. Now the way that we're going to make this work is by taking advantage of something that exists in HTML, which is called anchors. Now let me start by first showing you that somewhere else on our page, okay? So let's see how anchors work. So imagine that here on our tours section, I would place an ID, okay, and also called section tours. So it doesn't really matter here, it can be the same as the class. So I call this one here section tours with this ID. And so remember that IDs are unique, and so this here will be the only section called section tours, of course. And so HTML knows that. Now if I go up here and go to this button here, which we have, well, where is it? Here. So discover our tours. Okay, and so now I can put that ID name in here. So hash section tours. And let me show you what happens then. Well, first we have to actually hide this pop-up here. Okay, so let's very quickly do that. Just with display none. And we're gonna come back later to this. Okay, so now it's gone. And now when I hit this button, it goes to this section here. Okay, and you actually see it here in the URL. So section tours. And this is what's called an anchor. So here is now basically the anchor. And we can also say in other words that this is the target. So basically this element here was the target of that, okay? Now I'm just showing you that so that we can later make use of that target, okay? So remember this, and we're gonna come back to it in a second. Now before we can actually start with that functionality, we need to first hide this pop-up. But display none, as we have here, is not the best way, because if we have display none, we can then not animate it. Okay, so display is either none or something else. There's no numbers, and so we cannot animate it over time. So let's do it in a different way, and we did it already before a couple of times. So opacity 0, and also visibility hidden. Because remember, if we just set opacity to 0, then basically the text and the content will still be there, just not visible. And so now with visibility hidden, it's also at the same time hidden. And now, how do we actually make the pop-up visible? Well, we just used what we talked a minute before, and that is the anchor and the target. Okay? So what I'm going to do is first in the HTML, here in this tour, where is it? Yeah, here. So I will set this one here to pop up. So this is the button that should show or pop up when we click it, right? So this button, this one, and this one. And then we need to specify the ID down here at the pop-up. So ID pop-up. So when we click that button, then the anchor will basically become this pop-up. So the target, remember I called it the target, okay? So this pop-up here will become the target. And so what can we do here is to simply say, and that's actually it. So we have the pseudo class called target, which applies to the element which is the target when we click on the button, or basically when the URL changes to having target in it. Because let me show you that to you. If we now hit this here, you will see that now we have pop-up here. Okay, so in the URL, now we have pop-up. And so that is the target. And the target is on this pop-up here. And so we can do it like this. Now all I have to do is to say opacity 1 and visibility visible. And that's it. Now we also need to animate it here a bit. So let's say transition all in 0.3 seconds. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Well, we need to delete this here. And now take a look. And here we go. So the pop-up is now visible. Great, right? So it actually worked. Well, we have no way of closing it right now, but we will take care of that later. Let me show it again to you. I think the animation wasn't working quite well, but the functionality, at least, that is on point already. So it's working already right now. Okay, and the animation was not working because of these 0.3. I was missing the second here, but again, the functionality is just fine. So let me recap what happens here, so that we're 100% on the same page. So we have this button here, right? And so this one here. So we click this one here, and then as soon as we click, this here gets added to the URL of the page, okay? And so hash popup becomes the target. Okay, but since this one here has the ID of popup, the target is basically this entire element, okay? And so as soon as this element becomes the target, the pseudo class called target is available on it. And so we can then select that element using that pseudo class as we did here, and then specify our styles on it. And that's all we did. And as you see, it's working quite well. Now what we need next is a way of closing this pop-up. So let's actually put that here in the HTML. So we need like a small button. And so let's put that in here actually. So an anchor tag and pop-up close. Now the href here, it will be actually called section tours. Okay, and why is that? Well, because when we hit this link here, it will move to the section tours, okay, just as we did with the other button, and then this will become the target, right? And if the section tours becomes the target, then the pop-up is no longer the target, meaning that the pseudo class here no longer applies, and then that means, of course, that these styles disappear and the pop-up will be hidden again. So back to the initial state. All right, did that make sense? So basically what this closing button will do is to remove the target from the pop-up so that it simply loses these styles and then is back to its initial closed state. Okay, so let's now style that closing element. And actually we should put some text here. We just left it empty. And instead of putting a real icon here or something, I will just use another HTML entity, and that's called times. And that's basically like an X, okay? So pop-up close, and here it is. So if I now hit this one, and I think this H2 is now on top of it, but let's try it. No, it's not working because this is on top. So we first need to actually style it and position it. So pop-up close, and it's here already. And so let's do some positioning of this link. So we want the link state and the visited state. The color should be, well, the color of the text. I think we have a variable for that. Or actually not, I think. But it's here. I think it's simply this color. All right, so color gray dark. Then the position should be absolute. We want it 2.5 rem from the top and from the right. So basically in the top right corner. Let's increase it. And so 3 rem. And of course we want no text decoration. And it should also be displayed as an inline block. Okay, and then as soon as we hover it, it should just become green, so color primary. So let's take a look at that now. Well, we set the position here to absolute, and so it will be positioned to its first positioned parent. So which one is that? Well, it is actually the pop-up itself. Or isn't it? No, I think it's not, because the parent of this one here is the pop-up right, which doesn't have a defined position, but then the pop-up content has. And so it will be positioned relative to the pop-up content, which is fine. So we don't need to specify the position property on its parent element, okay? So let's just check this out. And here we go. And it actually worked already, right? So now here the target is section tours, and that means that the pop-up gets closed, because of course the target is no longer the pop-up. Alright, now it's not already positioned the way we want it to be, and it's not becoming green, but that's a minor problem that we can fix now. So the color, of course the problem is this one. And now as for the position, let's take a look at that again. So turning green now, but let's inspect it. And yeah, I see why that's happening. It's because you see it's really high, this element. It's much higher than actually the X symbol itself is. And that's because this is text. And so it has this predefined line height that we defined. So we should just set the line height to 1. And then it will actually be exactly here in the place where we want it to be. All right. So it now opens and closes just fine. But there's still one minor difference here, and that's this one. Take a look at the box now. So you see it basically it's coming in towards the user from the back of the page, zooming in towards us. So how do we do that? Well, that's actually very easy. Let's just go back here and well, let me take this code and put it a bit more down where it's more logical to be. So down here. So we want to style the content here, right? At the moment where the pop-up is opening. Well, and when does that happen? Well, of course, when the pop-up becomes the target. Of course, not that one. So, makes sense? Again, the pop-up here becomes the target, and then we simply style the child element of the pop-up, which is called pop-up content. Okay? So what should the initial state of this content be? Well, it's basically scaled down and it's also invisible, right? And so let's start by putting the opacity to 0 and we scale it. Now I'm going to put a transform here and scale, but it's not going to work. And I'm going to show you why, but I hope that you can already imagine why it's not going to work. Okay, because we actually ran into this problem before. So let me just show it to you. Well, that's the original, of course. That was stupid. So just so we can see it, let me show it to you. And so it's here. It's actually scaled down, but it's down here, where it should not really be, right? So let me inspect it and show it to you why it's happening this way. So the content here, reload it, and yeah, all right. So you see why it's happening? Because we defined this transform here, but we already had one transform. And you can only have one transform or one property in each declaration block, of course. And so this one here appears last, and therefore it overrides this one. Okay, so let's fix that. And we know that this transform actually comes from this absolute center. So what do we do when we want two transforms at the same time? Well, we have to put them in the same. And so we're basically repeating the one that we have coming from our mixin, but that's the only way that we have here to do it this way. Okay, and so now it should look all right. Okay, and now all we have to do is to then scale it back to 100% as soon as the pop-up opens. Okay, so let's do that. So the opacity is 0, so it's invisible, and then we put it back to 1 and scale it back to 1. Okay, so these here are basically the open states. So these two is when the pop-up is open, and that's when it's at the exact position with the perfect size, the perfect opacity, and of course the same thing here for the pop-up container, basically. All right, and with that we're almost good to go, I believe. We just have to add the animation here. So transition, all 0.4 seconds, let's say. So let's take a look at that now. All right, I just want to add something here to show you, and that's a small delay. So remember, transition is just a shorthand for a bunch of transition related properties, and one of them is transition delay. And so we can just delay this transition here by 0.2 seconds. So basically with this, we first allow the black background to come in, and then after that, we fade in our pop-up box, okay? So our pop-up content here. Well, it's actually not exactly after the pop-up fades in because that takes 0.3 seconds, but 0.2 is absolutely fine here. So we don't have to wait all the way until it's completely fade in. So let's try that now. And yeah, so I think that actually looks better. And maybe we can even start from something smaller here than 0.5. Let's say how it looks like with 0 and fading it in through half a second. So again, we can experiment with this, make it look like we want. And yeah, I like that one as well. Let's take a look again. All right, I think that works as well too. Maybe it's a bit too much, so let's put 0.25, but with that we should be good to go. Then again, you can change these values for yourself if you want to, but I really like it this way. All right, and with that we finished this huge part of the project. So almost 25 lectures, I believe, is this section. And so I'm really glad that you're still sticking with me here at this point. It's really good that you coded this entire web page here. And so I hope that you really feel this sense of accomplishment after creating such a huge project, okay? So really great job, and congratulations for that. However, we are not really done with this project, okay? Because right now it works on a big screen like this one. But what happens if we would see this on a mobile device? So what happens if we have a smaller screen like this? Well, then this is really a disaster, right? It doesn't look good at all. It's terrible, really. And so since this course is on advanced CSS and responsive design, I'm going to teach you how to make this design responsive over the next section, including a topic called responsive images, which is actually a pretty advanced topic. And so there's a lot more coming up in the next section. Really great content again. And so yeah, hope to see you there, and I'm waiting for you there.